Okay, so our story kicks off with this bearded guy anxiously pressing the head of the family about when he was finally planning to bring in the next daughter-in-law. He argued that all the recommended young ladies had already hit marrying age, and it wasn't even too late yet. They could bring them in right away to train in dribbling. He warned that if they let this chance slip, picking the next leader of the house would run into serious trouble. Sure, he understood they'd been putting the topic off precisely because things were tense in the city, but then he turned back to the master and asked whether Lady Ariadne hadn't passed away quite a while ago. Annoyed, the man asked why they were dragging this up right now, since leaving the daughter-in-law position open had been his own decision. The bearded guy even tried to justify himself, claiming he was only thinking about what was best for dribbling. But our young man asked him point blank whether he was really doing this for dribbling, or whether he just wanted his own daughters to get into the noble family. Out of patience, the leader declared he had nothing more to say and ordered everyone to get out at once. The guy still tried to push back against the order, but the boy gave him a defiant look and repeated that he'd better leave right now. His request makes all the other men stand up and tremble. They were terrified of the young master. Even the defiant man hurried to his feet, coughing dryly and suggesting it was better to wrap up the day's work right there. The second everyone was gone, the MC started drumming his fingers on the table, thinking about how the elder's pressure only kept building as time went on. He knew it was time to find a daughter-in-law. But he was also fully aware that if he picked a child to be raised alongside the elders, she'd definitely turn out arrogant in the future. So his dilemma was, where do you find a child with zero connection to the noble families of the city? Meanwhile, in another part of the mansion, a scream suddenly rang out. A group of girls was calling for someone, demanding to know how she dared not answer when called. A little skunk whipped her head around, startled, and apologized timidly, asking what was wrong. Pointing down the hallway, the human maid told her she didn't need to clean that room, ordering her to go to the office at the end of the corridor. And to make sure the skunk would obey, she threatened her. If the little one refused, she'd go all day without eating. When the poor thing looked toward where she'd been pointed, she pulled a face immediately, because she knew anyone could tell that area was off limits. But since she couldn't afford to refuse the human's orders, all that was left was to obey. Watching her bravely walk off toward the room, the other maids were surprised and started whispering, asking if she was stupid for just obeying like that. She probably didn't even know where she was walking into. And they had no doubt that in the end, there wouldn't even be bones left of the little creature to tell the tale. Listening to all of it in silence, the little skunk thought her hearing was sharp enough to catch every word. She knew it was wrong, but there was a reason she couldn't say anything. It was all because of her albinism. In that world, every mutant had a power called Iculus, which showed up in all kinds of forms, from swordsmanship to mana to divine powers. But an albino skunk like her was born with almost no energy, which kept her from being able to turn into a human. Because of that, she was treated as an inferior being by those girls, and by the rest of the world too. Discouraged, she looked up at the sky and screamed, totally frustrated, wondering why she'd been reincarnated into the worst possible scenario. This time, she'd woken up inside a romance novel. The story began with a South Korean actress, Rae Hein, who'd been sent to another world by a mistake of the gods. There, she became super famous as the only saint of that world. She really milked her popularity until she fell for the most powerful mage in the world, Caraxes Dribbling. Then, in a desperate attempt to win his heart, she even offered up the sacred dice, a holy relic of the church. The problem is, after he got the relic, the guy informed her that he'd taken a vow of chastity when he joined the magic tower. So in the end, all she got in return was Caraxes abandoning her. In that world, there was a saying that went, when a woman holds a grudge, snow falls even in the middle of summer, and that's exactly how Rae Hein ended up turning the place into a world of eternal winter, leaving the land barren too. From there on, the Holy Nation and the mages started plundering each other's resources, wrecking the relationship between the empires. And it was in exactly this scenario that our girl got transported into the body of an albino skunk. Not only that, but she was also a maid in the villain's mansion, Caraxes Dribbling, meaning if she made a single slip, she'd be wiped out for good. At first, she thought it was nice to have a body that moved the way she wanted, but even so, life didn't seem any better. Thinking about it, it wasn't all that different from her last life. She remembered her family, who'd go out to dinner and leave her totally abandoned at home. She never really knew what happiness was, if she was being honest, but at least she wasn't going hungry in this new life. On the rough days, our girl wondered if better days would come if she just hung in there for now, and she decided to focus on the positives, pumping herself up to do her best, because surely she'd find happiness one way or another. That was the exact moment the room's owner suddenly walked in. Radiating a dark aura, he demanded to know who had dared come in there without permission. And startled, the MC let out a sigh and covered her nose with her hand, curious about that pheromone that had taken over the whole room out of absolutely nowhere. As he got closer, our girl got more and more nervous with the guy's questions, as he kept repeating that he'd given explicit orders for no one to enter his library. Without answering, still covering her nose, she took in the details of the man in front of her. He had really dark black hair and eyes green like turquoise. No doubt about it, this was the master of the mansion, showing off the signature features of the Sword Tiger clan. When he noticed the little creature's presence, he let out a surprised sound and, yanking her up by the head, asked what this was and why there was a child there. Stammering, the MC tried to come up with an answer, knowing full well she had to be very careful if she wanted to get out of there alive. Already with tears in her eyes, the protagonist explained that she was just a servant, and that since she'd suddenly been sent to clean that area, she didn't really know the details. The guy didn't care about her explanation at first because he was curious about the fact that the skunk could talk in her animal form, since the structure of her mouth shouldn't allow that. But he got back on track, asking whether that was really true, repeating that cleaning there was forbidden and asking who had sent her. Still nervous about Kiraxis' presence, she revealed it was another servant of the palace. Judging by her ragged state and the fact that she didn't know the mansion's rules, the guy realized the MC was always treated this way. Curious, the mage asked where her family was, and she answered right away that she had no family. He kept up with the questions, wanting to know the albino's name, but to her bad luck, she confessed she didn't have one of those either. The poor thing was already starting to think the boy was messing with her, because he wouldn't stop with the questions about her friends, distant relatives, or acquaintances. But to the MC's surprise, Kiraxis smiled, totally satisfied, thinking a child with zero connections was simply perfect for his plans. So, faking compassion, the man asks if she wouldn't like to be adopted by him, which leaves her in complete shock. Except the mage already warned her he had one condition: the albino would have to become his family's daughter-in-law. Hearing that proposal, the little skunk froze. Did he have any idea what that meant? She knew the guy was proposing that she join the Sword Tiger clan, which meant his status within the house was enormous. Suspecting who he really was, the girl timidly asked what the boy's name was, and she tried to ease the tension, explaining that she wanted to know since they'd be living together a lot from now on. That's when he revealed his name, Kiraxis, leaving her paralyzed even though she'd already had her suspicions. He repeats his own name, formally introducing himself as Kiraxis Lucian Dibulain. That was enough to make the skunk panic as she realized she was standing in front of the mage himself, the villain of the story who used Saint Rehan. But what she couldn't understand was why he'd want to turn her into a daughter-in-law. Still, it lit a spark of hope in the MC's chest. Maybe this was her shot at a better life. The Dibulain family had a unique tradition. They'd pick a daughter-in-law early on to live alongside the potential heirs to the leadership. And once she was old enough, that daughter-in-law would marry whichever heir awakened her pheromones, thereby deciding the next head of the clan. There was just one small problem. Normally, 2 of the 4 heirs would activate the chosen one's pheromones, which led to a huge competition between them. So in practice, the one who decided the future of the clan was the daughter-in-law herself. That's exactly why the girl was shocked by the invitation to hold such an important position. This was the best opportunity she'd ever had across all her reincarnations. But the fact that the offer came from Kiraxis made her wary. What would she do if it was nothing more than a trap? She couldn't take the risk, so she decided to ask more questions. And playing dumb about the whole thing, the albino asked what she'd get if she accepted the position, to which Kiraxis replies with total indifference that she'd have good food, fine clothes, and a life of luxury, and that she'd asked a really dumb question. Regretting the question, she asked him directly why he was making this offer to her of all people. And, being honest, the guy explained that the clan needed a well-behaved child who wasn't yet under the elder's control. In other words, she was the perfect candidate. Those words sent a chill down the MC's spine, making her think the boy spoke like someone who could make her disappear without anyone noticing. As he walked out, Kiraxis asked if she had any more questions. Hesitant, the albino asked to ask just one more, and she questioned whether there'd be some kind of contract to sign about her arrangement. She knew that if one day she lost her usefulness and got kicked out of the family, she'd need to be prepared. She could leave the romance stuff to Rehan and focus on saving up as much money as possible in the meantime. Kiraxis looked away for a moment, reflecting in silence, but right after, he smiled mischievously and answered that he wasn't sure yet. That confusing answer left our girl indignant and even more convinced that this was, without a doubt, a trap. Suddenly, he called for Nina, and the orange-haired maid promptly answered her master. Seeing the woman, the skunk already started imagining Nina pulling out a knife and asking what a rat like her was doing in the castle, which only confirmed her suspicions about the danger she was in. But Kiraxis just handed her over to the maid and announced that, from that moment on, the little one would be his future daughter-in-law. He warned that he'd present her at the family meeting the next day, and ordered that she be well treated, and Nina held the little creature, asking what the young lady's name was. He'd already turned his back when he answered that, for now they could just call her Skunk, and ordered them to give her a bath and feed her. The moment he left, the maid formally introduced herself as Nina, explaining she was a cheetah beast woman, and declared she'd be her servant from that day on, which the little one thanked her for quickly, though she found it kind of scary, since beast women were natural-born predators, and a skunk was nothing but a snack to them. So much so that when Nina suggested taking her for a bath, even though she accepted, the MC became even more conscious that she'd have to be very careful so the girl wouldn't eat her. During the bath, the little one kept watching the maid's silence. The girl hadn't made a peep since earlier, and it actually made sense she'd be irritated about being assigned to look after an albino skunk. Noticing the MC's sad look, the maid asked if something was wrong. And a bit shy, the little one asked if she wasn't shocked by the situation and apologized for the trouble. In response, Nina called out to her in a serious tone, but out of nowhere, she started tickling her belly, which makes the little creature laugh, begging her to stop. When she stopped, the maid made it clear she shouldn't say things like that again, and she confessed she was truly honored to serve someone so wonderful, surprising the MC with that compliment. But the woman quickly explained she'd never seen a beast person capable of speaking in their animal form, which proved she was someone very special. And still a little insecure, the little one asked if it was really that amazing. Something Nina confirms, explaining that since humans and animals' vocal structures were totally different, this was an extremely rare talent. Feeling much happier with the compliment, the skunk thanked her from the bottom of her heart. To top it off, the maid even mentioned that, besides being special, the MC was extremely cute. And looking at her practically drooling, she said she looked like a little cake with a wild strawberry on top, confessing she felt like taking a bite. But the scare was so big that the skunk let out a scream of terror and leapt out of the tub to escape. Seeing she'd overdone the joke, Nina apologizes, promising not to repeat it, and calling her back to dry her fur. As she did it, Nina asked the MC to forget her worries and focus on getting a good night's sleep, and the little one agreed. Later, walking into her new room, the skunk finally collapsed onto the bed, sighing in exhaustion from everything that had happened that day. As she dragged herself toward the pillow, our girl thought about how long it had been since she'd lain in a comfortable spot like that, since she always ended up sleeping curled up in chimneys. She was really happy with the opportunity the universe had handed her, but she also knew it was too early to relax, since after all this was the villain's mansion and the family meeting would happen the next day. She couldn't stop wondering whether the Dribs would accept an albino skunk like her. Of course, she'd play the best daughter-in-law role possible, but in case things went wrong, her plan B would be to save up money to at least secure her independence. She couldn't turn into a human, but like Nina said, a talking skunk was something valuable and rare. Besides, Caraxes thought she was just an ordinary kid, but she had the advantage of knowing the plot of the novel and the secrets of the Holy Nation. She knew that if she used that to her advantage, she'd hardly ever get kicked out. Thinking about the future, the MC decided she'd start collecting small valuables the very next day. She just had to remember to prioritize light things she could carry off at any moment. Since our girl had no intention of going through another traumatic reincarnation, her only goal from here on was to do everything in her power to survive for a very, very long time. The next morning, the MC's breakfast was served with warm milk, fresh bread, and goat cheese. Faced with that feast, the little skunk didn't hide her joy and celebrated getting to eat well. She knew that, finally, she was getting decent treatment, totally different from the days when she was just a lowly servant, all while being closely watched by Caraxes and Nina. As she devoured the spread on the table, she praised the flavor of the food, tears of emotion on her face. Suddenly, Caraxes let out a murmur and with a surprisingly gentle gesture wiped a smudge of food off her face, recommending the girl eat more slowly. Faced with that scene, she was a little shocked, wondering if the great villain really had such a gentle side, concluding that, with looks like that, it was no wonder the protagonist Raheen had fallen for him. Still, she had to stay alert so she wouldn't get fooled. After all, in the original novel, that man had created a squad out of the corpses of his own relatives and hunted down the clan's heirs, who were his own cousins. Breaking the silence, Caraxes brought up the subject of her name, which made her choke in surprise and answer right away. Apparently, according to the records he found, her name was Ply. That info surprised the MC, discovering she had a registered name and wasn't just an unimportant extra in the story. Right after, the boy added that he couldn't keep her with that name, and so he'd already registered her with a new one, Florine, which makes the skunk wonder why he was the one who'd picked her name without asking. But despite that, she realized that after 7 reincarnations, this was the first time she'd gotten a real name, so she was more than satisfied. Besides, in the end, Florine was, without a doubt, a pretty name. Except the cute moment ended when Caraxes pressed his finger to her forehead and asked how a meatball like her already had wrinkles, and the MC asks who exactly he was referring to. The mage commented that they were going through hard times, so meat was the first thing to disappear from the tables. Our girl knew that well. She knew the situation was ugly, but she was more than satisfied with what she'd been offered. With a snap of his fingers, Caraxes commented that there was no other way, and he ordered more food to be brought so the girl could eat, since she needed to gain more weight. A new plate arrived at the table, leaving her amazed when she realized it was a cookie. Florine couldn't even remember the last time she'd had dessert, recalling that in her past lives that wasn't even a possibility. Her emotion only grew when Caraxes told her that if she wanted more, all she had to do was ask. All teary, she asked if he was serious. But soon a flicker of suspicion arose, making her wonder why he was being so nice. Could the boy be a kind person, unlike what the original book said? Suddenly, while handing her a few more cookies, the young man changed his tone and said he had something important to tell her, asking the MC to listen while she ate. She obeyed, and at last, the mage announced he'd be taking her to the family meeting that very day, which made poor Florine choke for real, dropping the cookie on the table out of pure panic. There'd be no escaping it. The family meeting had arrived, and she remembered she was there on the condition of becoming the drib daughter-in-law. Besides, according to the original story, all the clan's decisions were settled in these meetings. In other words, the approval of her marriage would be decided that very day. And if she didn't prove her usefulness, she'd lose the position, which made her wonder if she could get through such a difficult phase. Getting more and more nervous, Florine let out a worried sigh, which makes Caraxes try to calm her down, telling her not to worry about those senile old men, since they were all weaker than him. Discouraged, she just nodded, thinking that was the classic comforting advice of a villain. He turned and made it clear she'd understand once she saw the house's dynamics with her own eyes, asking her to let him know when she was ready. Ready to leave, he noticed the MC wanted to say something and asked what it was. Timidly, she held out the cookie in her hands. She felt like she'd already eaten too much, so she suggested Nina keep it. Surprised and grateful, the maid accepted the gift. Sweetly, Florine turned to Caraxes, and mentally fighting not to give up halfway, hesitantly held out another cookie, saying it was a gift for him too. After all, the mage had given her a room, a name, and the cookies, so this was a little present for later, since the girl would need a lot of help at the meeting. Even with his harsh words about the elders, the girl knew the guy's intentions were good. And more than anything, she knew Caraxes was her only salvation there, and she needed to make a good impression. Faced with all this, the boy let out a laugh and asked if this was an attempt at bribery or what. Panicking, the girl denied it and assured him it was just a genuine gift. With a faint smile, he accepted and thanked her, thinking surprised about how this little creature, who before had seemed so lost, now already knew how to use her head and was getting bold. He was curious to see how she'd do at the meeting. Sometime later, in the council room, Florine's face went completely pale, going into total meltdown because she couldn't think of a single plan, while the elders shouted in horror at the sight of an albino, asking whether Caraxes really wanted to stain the clan's future generations. They demanded the young master snap out of it, while another elder wanted to know what would become of the other available candidates. Seeing that explosive reaction, of course Florine got scared. She'd expected the rejection, she just didn't think it would be this much, to the point that the two chairs beside her were left empty out of pure contempt. Finally, the mage stepped in with a cynical smile, commenting that he wouldn't want to act this way in front of a child, but he'd noticed the elders were barking far too loudly that day, asking why they were acting like a pack of dogs. The old men got so choked up with rage they could barely stammer out a few words, which left Florine deeply impressed by the power of a true villain. In the middle of the chaos, she wondered where the head of the family was, because neither he nor the clan's official young master had shown up yet. That's when a voice announced the arrival of the 18th head of the great clan, Gripline, telling everyone to shut up. Speak of the devil, really, and there he was, and the girl was shocked by his posture. The moment Lafreniere, the patriarch's assistant, ordered that no one pollute the air with their own voices before the leader's entrance, he used a pheromone-neutralizing spray to purify the room, and with disdain, announced the path was clear for the family head's entrance. The mage watched the scene with disgust and thought out loud that this guy was a fanatical worshiper of his father, always overdoing the theatrics with that spray, and that made the girl wonder what kind of man the family leader would be. Finally, the lord arrived and coldly asked if everyone was well. One of the elders jumped up hurriedly to greet the man, but noticing Caraxes remained seated, the head asked whether he wasn't going to greet his own father. The young man was disrespectful, saying that greeting him or not was his choice. His father, irritated, wanted to know how long he'd keep up that hard posture, to which the young man shot back with disdain, explaining it'd be until his mood improved. Florine watched it all, amazed as if she were watching a soap opera. At least until the patriarch pushed his glasses up and scolded his son, saying that with his sister gone, he had to take on the clan's responsibility instead of acting like a spoiled little boy. Looking at the man, our girl thought he looked more like a gangster than a noble leader. That's when the head of the family noticed the little creature curled up in his son's coat, letting out a sound of surprise, which made the little skunk jump in fright and scream. Curious, he asked his assistant what that was, to which the man answered that, given Caraxes' track record of weird collections, it was probably an albino skunk. The mage cut the subject off quickly, warning his father to back off, since this was his future daughter-in-law, which left him surprised, asking to look at the little thing more closely, which only made Florine's situation worse. She'd tried to hide inside the guy's coat, but now she was so deep in it, she was afraid of suffocating. Even so, the man fixed his eyes on her without blinking for a single moment, and the closer he got, the more the little one begged for help. Lafreniere let out a discreet little laugh before returning to his usual posture and suggesting the meeting begin anyway, getting permission from his chief. The gesture left Florine a bit confused, wondering if the two had just smiled at her, and thinking that if she did everything right, that could be an advantage in the future. Seizing the opening, one of the elders tried to stir things up with the patriarch, reporting that the young master intended to bring in that albino creature of completely unknown origin as the daughter-in-law. Seeing his insistence, Florine concluded the man really had a huge prejudice against albinos to be protesting so eagerly. The elder kept up his protest, claiming the clan's future would be ruined, but the patriarch cut him off coldly. reminding him he hadn't yet given anyone permission to speak. The leader then turned to Curaxis and pointed out that if he'd caused all that mess, he surely had a plan in mind, demanding to know what it was. Except the boy simply answered that he didn't feel like talking about the subject. The black-haired old man exploded with rage at the young man's tough guy pose, asking how he dared speak to his father that way. But Curaxis, with no patience for the lecture, commented that he was already tired of listening to the guy's barking and snapped his fingers. In a flash of magic, the elder's complaints turned into exaggerated compliments, as if they were yelling about how cute, polite, and adorable the little boy was, like a sweet little puppy. Florine was shocked by the change in tone, and the elders, realizing the absurdity of what they'd just said, went totally silent. Curaxis proudly explained he wasn't about to let a child be exposed to those words and asked everyone to keep restraining themselves, making Florine understand the sorcery had been his doing. Lowering his voice, he added that the girl in his lap had no academic connections, regional ties, or history of bribery. In other words, unlike the other candidates, she was a pure child with no political backing whatsoever, which was more than enough to make her the family's daughter-in-law. One of the elders even tried to argue, justifying that their only goal in recommending candidates with extraordinary abilities was to serve the family, backed up by his colleague, who reminded everyone the young lady's position had been vacant since Lady Ariadne's death, and that despite the young man's authority, the rules ought to be followed. But the two were cut off when Curaxis shot them a deadly look and gave a final warning, asking whether they'd already forgotten the warning, never to mention his sister's name that way, warning them they'd definitely regret it if it happened again. Florine broke into a cold sweat at the young man's explosive reaction, but she finally understood the timeline, remembering the story was taking place after Ariadne's death, which meant the young master's chair Curaxis occupied had belonged to her. Ariadne Hera Durabalain was the boy's older sister, and a genius among so many scholars, born with dominant pheromones. After being named the official heir, she delivered perfection in every field, from politics to economics to swordsmanship, breaking the tradition of purely male leadership. But our heroine ended up dying on the battlefield, and the grief over his sister was why Curaxis refused to officially take the post, leaving that chair empty for so long. That's when the boy broke the silence, riding the wave of the topic of his sister, setting the condition that, if that child were accepted as the family's official daughter-in-law, he'd carry out his father's old wish and immediately take on the position of young master. The revelation was a total shock. The elders gasped together in surprise, and even his father's jaw dropped. Meanwhile, Florine herself let out a cry of disbelief, stunned to see he was going this far just to secure her marriage within the house. Stroking the skunk's head with a smile, Curaxis asked everyone present whether the fact that the girl had made him cave on his stubbornness didn't already prove she had incredible abilities, tossing the decision to the council. Desperate, she tried to wriggle free, mentally begging not to be dragged into the middle of that mess. One of the young men kept his hard stance, commenting that calling that an ability was a stretch, but Curaxis shot back instantly, reminding them they themselves had said all it took was an exceptional capacity, and that his power of persuasion was definitely something new. With irony, he concluded that if everyone there truly valued the good of the clan, they'd surely agree to his conditions. Florine finally realized he wasn't playing around. He was notifying the elders of his decision. The patriarch suddenly smiled, looking at the skunk, who got confused again. She wasn't used to so much admiration. He kindly commented that it seemed his son really liked her, making Florine think about how to respond so she wouldn't come off too awkward, concluding that confirming the young master's affection would be the best way out. But she couldn't even say anything, because Curaxis's father pondered that, since it was rare to see his son so determined to take on the leadership like this, he'd never go against his wishes. Watching the exchange of glances, the MC understood the patriarch was trying to convince the other men, because he genuinely believed in her, so she decided it was time to show what she was made of if she wanted to secure her survival and her future life of luxury in the clan. Accepting that she'd need to use her trump card sooner than she'd expected. Working up her courage, Florine jumped onto the meeting table and loudly asked for everyone's attention, announcing she had a hidden ability that would interest them greatly. Surprised, the patriarch really wanted to know what kind of power that was, and she, lowering her voice mysteriously, before opening her eyes wide and raising her hand with total confidence, ordered them to just trust her and buy that land immediately. The moment she finished speaking, the atmosphere in the meeting room plunged into absolute silence. Faced with this, the head of the family pondered whether she meant for them to buy the territory she'd mentioned. Something Florine confirmed, explaining she could tell them which territory to buy and the reasons why. Hearing the answer, the man smiled in acknowledgement, commenting that she not only knew how to talk, she also gave real estate advice, so she must be a truly fascinating creature. But his reaction annoyed the little one, because she soon realized he thought it was all a joke. Even so, determined, she quickly turned to the assistant and asked if his name was Wafrien, asking whether he had a map, which the boy confirmed, making her ask him to open it for her on the table. Florine thanked him but got straight to the point, pointing at the map right after, and indicating to the family head the exact spot he should buy. Noticing the location pointed out, the patriarch protested in surprise, because that was the Luxoria area, stressing that, even though the region was quite large, its market value was extremely low, and he asked if there was a special reason for the choice. Of course, Florine knew the land's current situation was exactly that, but she reminded him the place had once been very famous for wheat cultivation, which proved the extreme fertility of the soil, and that in the future one of the heirs would use that same region to propose to Raheen. After those memories filled her head, the MC let out a little laugh and explained the land was excellent for planting wheat, and that although it seemed useless at that moment because it was winter, it would soon prove valuable, revealing that spring was about to arrive. Hearing that, all the elders asked in great astonishment whether spring really was coming. Apparently that was impossible, and even Caraxes was caught off guard by this information. The brown-haired elder stood up quickly and pushed back at the girl for telling lies, arguing that one only had to look at her to see she'd been born after the saint's destructive outburst, and asked how she could possibly know what spring was. The head of the family also showed suspicion and asked whether she even knew what spring was. With a brilliant smile, the little one answered yes, explaining that, with the arrival of the new season, the snow would melt, allowing new plants to be sown, and that many animals would also appear, advising it was better to buy the land while prices were still low. The patriarch continued his suspicious interrogation, wanting to know how she could be so certain. Florine broke into a cold sweat and stammered, not knowing what to say. She hadn't anticipated that question, but she knew she couldn't just reveal she'd read all of this in a novel. She turns to Caraxes, hoping he could help her. Seeing the girl lost, Caraxes let out a sigh and thought he'd figured she was a smooth talker, but that she'd already used up all her excuses, considering whether he should pretend to help just to tease her a bit. That's when he butted in, suggesting it made sense the skunk could see the future, but his comment made the head of the family raise an eyebrow, curious to know what his son meant by that. So Caraxes smiled and answered that there was something he hadn't told them yet, revealing that in fact, that child was the saint. The instant he made that declaration, every elder's jaw dropped, and even his father was stunned, not knowing what to say in that situation. Even poor Florine let out a scream, shocked, thinking in absolute despair that she'd asked for help, but the guy had managed to make her situation even more complicated. After that, the meeting room became total chaos. One of the counselors went white as paper and demanded they repeat what had been said about her being a saint. Within the council, some elders refused to believe Caraxes' words, while others, more naive, blindly believed the revelation. Believing it or not, after this whole story, Florine started receiving gifts daily for a week. Holding an enormous stack of boxes, Nina asked where she should put the new snacks that had arrived that day, and the MC sighed, answering, discouraged, that anywhere would do, since she thought nothing else could fit there anymore. The maid nodded. Our girl stayed silent, deeply irritated in her thoughts, blaming Caraxes for inventing that lie about her being the saint. She remembered the exact moment he'd dropped her in that mess and wondered what she'd do if anyone found out the fraud. She believed he had a detailed plan, but to her surprise, when she questioned him, Caraxes just told her to fake it and push back if anyone said anything, since everyone had believed it, leaving the girl teary with no answer. He simply left the room and disappeared after that. Noticing Florine had bitten her lollipop in half, Nina commented curiously that the MC was very strong and asked if she was bored, to which Florine answered she wasn't bored. She was angry. Hearing that, the maid suggested the bad mood was because of the snow outside, which had been hammering the days and making the girl feel trapped from staying in her room all the time, and asked if she'd like to play something. But Florine refused and said it was fine, pointing out she knew Nina had been busy. The comment left the maid charmed by the young lady's consideration, which made the girl even more embarrassed. It hadn't been long since she'd discovered Nina was Caraxes' only maid. At first, she found it strange he had only one person and mentally blamed him for it, but upon discovering the full story, she was impressed. In reality, Nina was an assassin sent to kill Caraxes, but he managed to capture her and used his magic to force her to work as a servant for 10 years. Now she thought it was an excellent method. She had to ask the mage to teach her more when he had time. After all, if she could pull off the same thing, she'd be fine even if she got kicked out of the mansion. Snapping out of her thoughts, Florine sat at the table and asked Nina to hand her her sketchbook. The maid fulfilled the request, handing over the colored pencils at the same time. After so much stress, the time had finally come for the MC to plan her super comfortable future. She knew that, if she kept pretending to be the saint and officially became the clan's daughter-in-law, one of the heirs would be her husband. Since they'd all end up falling for Raheen later in the story, the little one didn't have to worry about which of them would be the chosen one in the end. Her real goal was to prevent the ruin of the Dribblane family, since she'd worked hard to reach the noble position and wouldn't accept being thrown out onto the street under any circumstances. So to achieve that, she needed to build her own power base, regardless of which husband chose her. Besides, if she could avoid the clan's collapse, that would be one more advantage. In other words, she needed to solve the main cause of the family's decline, which in the original novel was a great tragedy. The original plot revolved around Raheen healing the childhood traumas of the male protagonists, so if the heirs suffered less in their youth, the outcome would be less tragic. There were a few important boys for the MC to keep an eye on. The first was Dante, the only direct descendant and son of Ariadne, followed by Yuri, Ariadne's youngest son who carried the royal blood of the Magic Kingdom. And lastly, Gerard, who though not Ariadne's son, carried the blood of the royal family of Lickenbium. Since Raheen was still isolated, Florine had in her hands the perfect chance to meet the boys while they were still children. As soon as she finished drawing up the plan, she was willing to do anything to make it happen. She just needed to follow a few steps, become Deverliane's daughter-in-law, keep them from finding out she was a fake saint, so she could expand her political influence, build relationships with the family members before Raheen's arrival, and save the protagonists from their tragic fates. Satisfied with the perfect plan, the little creature lay down, celebrating that everything would turn out exactly as planned if things kept going the way they were. But she knew life didn't always grace her with so much luck, so maybe it'd be good to prepare for the worst-case scenario too. But before that, she needed a little sweet. As she ate her bonbon, the girl could only think that, even being a fraud, the saint's life was excellent and she'd love for it to stay that way forever. With spring's arrival, her position would become even more secure and fewer people would doubt her status. And if that happened, she'd just need to find more information she'd gotten from reading the novel to use to her advantage. The problem is, she didn't know exactly when spring would arrive there. Her thoughts are interrupted by sudden knocks at the bedroom door. Nina asked who it was, while Florine wondered the same thing. The person on the other side identified himself as Lafrienne and announced that the head of the family was looking for Lady Florine, which was a big surprise to our girl. He insists on knocking, noticing the silence that had settled over the room, until the door opened. The girl presented herself in Nina's hands. Her intuition never failed. She heard the boy say he'd take her to the master. While she could only think of one thing, spring had finally arrived. So it was time to start selling the information she had about the Holy Nation. Pointing ahead, a black-haired man excitedly showed the patriarch that the child's prediction had come true. Because a new sprout had been discovered in Luxoria, and he admitted he'd been skeptical at first, but that buying the territory had been the right call, predicting the value of that land would soon skyrocket. The head of the family stayed silent, watching the screen for a while, until Florine's voice echoed announcing her arrival and asking if she could come in. Of course, the man gave her permission to enter quickly. As he carried Florine, Lafrienne kept repeating to himself that he couldn't let the young lady fall. Meanwhile, the little one smiled non-stop, greeting the patriarch and asking if he was well. He smiled back, confirming he was great, and asked her name, and she promptly reintroduced herself as Florine. And the man assured her he'd remember the name next time. The MC found the attitude strange and figured something very good must have happened for the patriarch to be so excited that afternoon. Pointing to a glass of milk, he invited her to sit and drink while they talked. She accepted without thinking twice, but got worried seeing the glass was a bit too big, remembering Nina always gave her smaller utensils to make her life easier. Noticing the situation, the head of the family commented it must be hard for the protagonist to transform, and promised to have a special, exclusive set of utensils made just for her, which surprises the MC a bit, and she thanks him for the care. But the patriarch answered proudly that it was nothing, and that he'd do anything for his family's treasure. Looking at the men present there, the girl noticed the affection in everyone's eyes, and she thought happily that the saint fraud should last forever, since she was loving feeling wanted. The head of the family cleared his throat and explained he'd called the girl in because they'd discovered a sprout in Luxoria, something Florine had already imagined. But the leader continued, explaining he needed to talk to her about something else, and the little one got even more curious. Finally, the patriarch detailed that the family had acquired the territory according to her guidance, and that since it was still winter the week before, they'd managed to buy everything for a very low price. Florine was impressed by how naturally he spoke about purchasing an entire region. He continued, proposing right after to plow all the land to turn it into a planting area, and he wanted her opinion, which left the skunk speechless. The man insisted, saying she herself had said they needed to prepare for planting with spring's arrival, and that made the girl indignant, because she had a strategy to make the territory's value rise. But the MC soon noticed something in the guy's eyes. She knew exactly what was going on. In reality, he was testing our girl, and she knew she had to pass any test that came her way. Carefully, she explained she had a slightly different idea, and her comment makes the patriarch smile, curious to know what she was scheming. So Florine laid out her strategy, arguing that, although his proposal was good, the best thing to do would be to auction off the land and sell it to the royal family for a really high price. In the original novel, that first sprout signaled the start of spring in Luxoria, causing chaos in the Magic Kingdom and the Holy Nation. In the original story, the region's value had risen to unimaginable levels, and if they cultivated the land themselves, they'd be accused of monopolizing spring's fruits. Besides, the skunk stressed that local production wouldn't be enough to supply the whole Magic Kingdom, so it'd be better to sell the territory for the highest possible price while everyone was interested. The man was very pleased with the suggestion, praising her reasoning and asking how she'd reached that conclusion. So as not to seem too arrogant, Florine made up that the idea had just popped into her head, knowing she needed to think fast for the good of the clan, which would also bring her plenty of benefits. In the original work, the Dribliane family, despite being the villains of the story, maintained a strict reward system, which meant that the bigger the profit from selling the land, the more money she'd get in return. Riding the momentum, she decided to try to score even more favors. With more confidence, the MC calls the patriarch, saying she had something else to tell him, and he showed even more interest and leaned in, dying to know more about the new information. Feeling a wave of excitement sweep through her body, Florine realized she was finally getting his full attention. She asks whether he remembered her prediction about spring's arrival and how the sprout appeared right after, and the man confirms. When she comments that the new season would spread across the entire world soon, it becomes clear to the man that they'd need to sell Luxoria as soon as possible. One of the counselors smiles, thrilled by the girl's plan, commenting that the royal family would bitterly regret paying for the territory, and the others laugh wickedly, along with the MC, who looked like a true soap opera villain. But the moment she realized she was behaving that way, the girl got startled, wondering why she got along so well with that kind of people. She noticed the group seemed to have more fun provoking the royal family than with the money itself, because all they could talk about was how furious the emperor would be at those maneuvers. Except that didn't matter. She still had one more thing to tell the patriarch, drawing his attention again. So she asks whether the family had seeds and fertilizers. The question made the man's expression shift from joy to total shock. Delighted, the head of the family immediately deduced her intentions, predicting that, with spring arriving across the whole empire, they could sell the seeds and fertilizers developed by Derbliane. And Florine confirmed, praising the Lord's quick thinking. Excited, she continued, saying the whole country would need those materials to plant. So the patriarch concluded that the protagonist's real plan was to totally dominate the market. Thrilled, she confirmed the intention, guaranteeing the clan would reach extraordinary success. Our girl had total confidence in her words as she said that, because she remembered that, in the book, the family was famous for its military power, especially for making ammunition and weapons like no one else. But it also had enormous knowledge about cultivation, all thanks to the research of the current Duchess, who'd made a pact with an earth spirit to help the starving population. It was thanks to her efforts that Derbliane's seeds were of far superior quality to others, and now that spring had arrived, those seeds could grow even faster, which meant more food for the population. In other words, in the end, everyone would benefit from her plan. But there was one small problem. Only family members knew about that confidential research, so the MC was afraid they'd get suspicious of her real intentions. Suddenly, the Lord leaned in, curious, and commented he doubted that was just a guess from the little one, asking where she'd gotten such restricted information. Florine's fear had come true right in front of her, because she knew very well that all that knowledge would seem very suspicious. Not knowing what to say, she decided the only way out would be to blame Caraxes. At least they'd be even after he invented the lie about her being the saint's reincarnation. Forcing a smile, she revealed all awkwardly that the mage had told her everything, calling him Kiss because she couldn't pronounce the guy's name out of nervousness. The head of the family was shocked by the nickname and wanted to know if she meant Caraxes, to which Florine confirms, still kind of awkward, and explains his name was very hard to pronounce. Of course, the people in the room couldn't hold back their laughter at the nickname given to the young master. Red as a tomato with embarrassment, the little one explained quietly that she'd said she wanted to help the family, and that because of that, Caraxes had offered to collaborate and told her about the seeds. The Lord still tried to contain his laughter as he said he understood the son had helped the girl come up with that plan. And at last he praised her with enthusiasm, declaring that the skunk thinking up something so grand with such a tiny head was something worthy of admiration, adding that she deserved a reward for it. And hearing about the reward, Florine perked up. The head of the family explained the clan was known for being greedy by nature, and that when they wanted glory, they wouldn't stop until they got it. But you couldn't just grab anything you wanted. She herself had to set the value of her own achievements, since that experience would serve as a foundation for her to handle the family's internal affairs in the future. And this last part surprises our girl. Did this mean the patriarch was definitively accepting her as a member of the clan? Florine was used to being just a wanderer, with no home or family ties, but now she'd finally found a place to call home. Noticing the girl's joy, the leader repeated the question about what price she'd charge for what she'd done. And in that moment, it became clear the man didn't want a quiet, obedient child, but a very well-mannered one. Those people only needed one thing, a person truly worthy of carrying the title of daughter-in-law of House Drybelebane. So she knew that moment was also a test of her ambition. And if that was indeed the case, she made a point of showing she had ambitions big enough to stand at the feet of the house. So she started to answer, declaring firmly that she wanted the Drybelane family itself as payment. The statement shocked the counselors instantly, and even the patriarch himself, who hadn't expected such a frank answer, asked what the girl was saying. But Florine kept her gaze firm and confirmed the request. The looks between the two were full of tension. Except the girl didn't back down, insisting that she wanted the Drybelane family. He asks if she was sure of what she was saying. So the girl confirms once more, explaining that the Drybelane family was the strongest and best house in the entire world. The relatives were clearly uncomfortable with her words, finding the girl's wish a bit over the top. The leader fixed his sharp eyes on her, reflecting, until he let out a sigh and reached out his hand, making poor Florine tremble with fear, believing she'd gone too far and would surely be punished. But to everyone's surprise, the patriarch lifted her up and started to rock and stroke her face, saying the little creature was truly adorable. The attitude also shocked the family members, who scolded the chief. After the affection, the leader set the MC on the table and explained he couldn't hand her the family just yet, but he had something else in mind. From that day on, the girl would have her own room on the second floor of the main building as a reward. This fills the MC's eyes with tears. She knew the house's customs, but she didn't imagine she'd be rewarded so fast. Very happy, the little one thanks him deeply, but the patriarch considered that just the room didn't seem to be enough. And he asked her age, but the girl confessed she didn't know. She might have some idea if she could take on her human form, but she couldn't feel her inner power no matter how hard she tried, so that wasn't going to happen. She felt a deep sadness over her albino condition, making her incapable of that, and she really wanted to be able to transform. Noticing the change in the girl, the head of the family comforted her, explaining he'd only asked because she seemed to be at the age where she needed a nanny, and he assured her he'd find a way to help her transform. But even if she couldn't change form, she'd always be a member of the family, so she didn't need to worry about losing her position. Consciously, she knew the Lord was right. No matter what happened, Florine was a member of House Tribelane now. So she decided that instead of putting herself down, she'd work even harder to prove her usefulness to the clan. To repay the support, she decided to reveal her last secret, telling the patriarch there was still one more piece of information. Asking the counselors for a map, which they provided quickly. Asking whether there'd be another territory to fight over with the royal family. Something Florine denied, assuring this information was even more important. She pointed at several specific locations on the map at once, and with total confidence delivered the news that all the mentioned points would be attacked soon, which makes the guys jump out of their chairs. One of the men examined the map with suspicion, questioning how a child could know about war zones and whether they should trust that information. Florine asked them to believe her once more, reminding everyone her prediction about spring had come true and warning that they'd regret it if they didn't act accordingly, stressing that she'd suffer too if they were attacked, so there was no reason for her to lie. And the head of the family reflected on the arguments and agreed with her reasoning, thinking that the girl's dignified, confident posture made her more and more suited to the clan. That's why he'd decided to follow the child's guidance, asking Lafrienne to relay this to his allies, demanding the utmost care so no one would hear, and he obeys without thinking twice. However, the other clan members were shocked by that bold move, arguing the patriarch was judging the situation far too hastily. Faced with the questioning, the leader asked them to think a little more, explaining that if that information was true, their soldiers would be saved, and that, even if it was false, the commotion would still serve to sow chaos in the holy nation. In other words, they had nothing to lose. Then the family master looked at Florine with affection, confessing that, above all, he really wanted to trust that child. So he announced they needed to hold an emergency meeting about defending the front line and ordered the little one to go choose her new room. The girl was so happy about it, she felt her heart leap out of her chest. In her thoughts, she just deeply wished to be recognized by the clan head, but beyond that, her biggest worry was not disappointing the person who decided to believe in her, hoping deeply that her information really would be useful. From that day on, Florine got her own room, exactly as the patriarch had promised. An elderly woman entered her room, introducing herself as Evangeline, her new nanny. And besides her, a maid named Linda introduced herself as the one in charge of the little one's bath and clothes, while a knight named John introduced himself as the girl's personal bodyguard. So Florine gained a nanny, a maid just for her, and a bodyguard. And of course Nina was still by her side, giving the girl pudding to eat, which she enjoys without thinking twice. The maid praises the MC's big appetite. Jealous of the scene, Linda protested against her colleague, calling Nina selfish and begging to also be put in charge of serving the mistress's snacks. Joined by John, Florine felt like she was in a dream. In her old life, she'd never have dared dream of what she was living now. Noticing her popularity within the Tribelane family growing more and more each day, since she lay down and woke up surrounded by servants begging for a chance to serve her. However, she started wondering whether Caraxes already knew about everything that was happening. The day after the council meeting, the guy had officially inherited the position of young master, and because of that, he'd been much busier than before, making meetings between the two extremely rare. Florine sat on the bed a bit worried, remembering he'd only left her a gift. It was a golem named Pom-Pom, which Caraxes had given her the last time they'd seen each other. Now that she stopped to think, it had been a while since then, he'd handed Pom-Pom to her personally 2 nights after the first council meeting. Flashbacks of when the girl was woken up in the middle of the night by the strong moonlight coming through the window come to mind. She remembered Caraxes had suddenly appeared in her room, asking if she'd already fallen asleep, which was more than obvious considering the hour the two met. The boy explained he knew it was late, but that if he didn't deliver the gift right then, he wouldn't know when he'd get another chance. A magical light of transformation appeared in his hand, illuminating Florine, who seemed very surprised by the whole situation, and revealing the creature, which the MC confirmed was indeed a golem. The boy explains it was a communication golem, since he imagined she'd like to say good morning and good night to him often. The little one was paralyzed and speechless at the size of the guy's self-confidence, but he just kept listing the gift's special functions, explaining that all she had to do was tap the doll's head twice to activate the translator function, guaranteeing the golem would accurately translate everything she said, even if the sentence was confusing. The little creature hugged the golem and thanked him with a smile for the gift, promising she'd put it to good use, which seems to have left the guy very satisfied, and that was the last time they talked. Thinking about it, the girl felt a pang of sadness, but she also understood he'd been very busy with his new duties. Besides, she'd received a very special gift, Determined, the girl promised herself she'd work even harder so her name would reach Caraxus's ears, and she'd count on Pom-Pom's support from there on. Two maids who were in the hallway noticed an unusual commotion. It was our girl strolling through the mansion atop the head of John, her new bodyguard. The maids commented excitedly that thanks to the girl's predictions about the imminent attack, many soldiers on the battlefield had been saved. Another maid agreed, adding that the clan had not only had time to evacuate the civilians, but had also organized a surprise counterattack. A few days earlier, the enemy army had gone to the Magic Kingdom's border to plan an ambush for the knights, and the rival commanders advanced confidently, sure they'd teach the mages a lesson, and that they'd wipe them out completely. They just never imagined the mages were one step ahead. Suddenly, the captain was struck by an arrow to his chest, startling the other soldiers. The men's eyes went wide in surprise, and it didn't take long for screams of despair to echo when a pack of ferocious tigers emerged from the shadows, quickly finishing off the invading troops. The Holy Nation really had sent soldiers to attack exactly as Florine predicted, but thanks to the clan's advanced preparation, they were stopped and got the worst of it. The story of the troops' triumph spread throughout the Duralbane region, turning the little skunk into a true celebrity. Despite the success, there were still people not at all happy with the situation, and one of the staff murmured that letting an albino represent the clan was a huge stretch. But hearing that prejudiced comment, the maids who supported the girl immediately scolded their colleague, warning he'd be punished if he got caught saying that. Florine couldn't help overhearing those comments, but she tried not to care about the narrow minds of the people around her. Still, the maids keep defending her, claiming the saint was a very special skunk and was only incapable of turning into a human because she'd used up her magic strength to summon spring. That justification in reality was a fake rumor they'd intentionally spread to protect her from any doubt that might come up. Honestly, Florine felt extremely pleased with the way the gossip was going, since after all those rumors were very convenient, and the one most responsible for spreading them was none other than the Duke of Dribblane. Later, in the dining room, Florine savored a cookie before a banquet of snacks the patriarch had ordered prepared. Wondering why she'd been summoned there out of nowhere, breaking the silence, the head of the family called out to the MC affectionately and explained the topic might seem a bit out of left field, but he needed to say that he didn't believe she was a real saint. Hearing that, the girl went into total panic. She felt a shock run through her body, terrified of having been found out, since she was convinced she hadn't left a single suspicious clue behind. So, even trembling with nerves, she asked what the patriarch meant by that. Until the leader explained calmly that he simply didn't believe in the existence of gods, and that for that reason, he didn't care whether she was a real saint or not. And his words brought immense relief to Florine, who realized she'd gotten scared for nothing. The patriarch continued, stating that, given the fulfillment of her predictions, to the world she truly would be the saint who'd awaken spring, guaranteeing he'd spread the news that the Holy Nation's saint was a fraud and assuring her he'd never let anyone belittle her. Florine was amazed by his stance, finding the strategy worthy of a true villain and feeling happy to be protected against the prejudiced people surrounding her. Besides, she thought that, with spring's arrival, a peace treaty would be signed soon, which would spare her from having to predict any new military confrontations. But despite the relief, the MC remembered she couldn't get comfortable yet, and that she needed to keep working hard to maintain her value in the clan's eyes. Noticing the little one's sigh atop his head, John asked, worried if she was feeling unwell, but the girl denied it. Quickly changing the subject, the girl made up that she was just thinking about the best way to compliment the chef on the delicious pudding she'd had earlier. The bodyguard sighed in relief and praised the young lady's consideration and sensitivity, since he found her very different from the other clan members. And Florine smiled sheepishly, aware she'd raised the knight's expectations of the saint even higher. But she tried to console herself, since she knew that good reputation would eventually reach Caraxus's ears, calling Pom-Pom to witness her success. Suddenly, the sound of crying interrupted Florine's thoughts and caught John's attention. Curious, the little girl and he followed it until she realized the sound was coming from the kitchen, and fearing the worst, she asked the knight to take her there immediately, an order the bodyguard fulfilled at once. They get closer and closer, watching through the crack of the door what was really happening. Inside, the helpers were trying to console the chef, asking him not to be so sad. The man turned around in tears, recognizing the voice that had consoled him. Our girl entered the room smiling as always. Noticing the duo's arrival, Jep wiped his tears and asked what the young lady needed from the kitchen. With a brilliant smile, Florine explained she'd gone there just to thank him for the wonderful banquet he'd prepared that day. That display of affection left Jep's eyes full of tears again. Our girl cared a lot about staying close to him. She knew that, if they became friends, her meals would stay delicious even after Rahin's arrival. Worried, Florine wanted to know why so much crying and asked if someone had intimidated the chef, promising to confront the guilty party if that were the case, which only caused even more commotion there in the kitchen. The poor guy was already sobbing again, and even tried to hold it back but ended up bursting into tears once more. The MC was starting to think someone really had done something bad to the man. Faced with the girl's concern, one of the kitchen helpers approached and whispered in her ear to look to the side. Florine looked quickly, afraid of what she might find. but she came face to face with a completely burnt and shattered pudding amid the ashes. So, the helper revealed in whispers that the clan's heirs had been unhappy with the meals and took out their frustrations on the kitchen, and that the chef hadn't been able to take the pressure of that last humiliation. Florine was indignant about it, because the heirs were her potential suitors and were wasting food like that even in such hard times, concluding they had not an ounce of decency, and demanding to know the culprit's identity, guaranteeing she wouldn't marry someone like that, which makes the helper back off since she didn't think that was necessary. But the confusion was interrupted when someone walked into the kitchen, asking if that little thing was the albino skunk everyone was talking about. The newcomer comments he thought the patriarch's story was just a joke, and asks, disgusted, whether he really would have to marry an albino animal. Florine glared at the boy, wondering who this snot-nosed kid was, while John and the other servants bowed their heads in respect and greeted the young master Gerard. The boy's identity shocked the girl. She immediately recognized him as one of the protagonists of the original novel, remembering that, in the future, the guy would beg on his knees with a whip in hand for Rahin not to abandon him. In the book, he was described as a beautiful, decisive, and polite prince. But the childish version in front of her seemed so despicable that Florine couldn't hold back a mocking burst of laughter, shocking everyone around her, until she mocked the fact that he was nothing but a spoiled little boy. The girl's loud laugh terrified the kitchen helpers and the knight John, who shrank back, afraid of the prince's reaction. Gerard was deeply irritated by the mockery and asked furiously whether that creature was really laughing at him, demanding to know what was so funny. Faced with the boy's rudeness, John reminded the young master he shouldn't refer to the young lady that way, but he shot back, shouting that the girl herself had started the insults. However, the more the prince yelled and tried to act mature, the more Florine found him ridiculous and funny, admitting to herself that his fury only made him cuter. Noticing the girl's new laugh, Gerard gets indignant at the audacity of an albino laughing at him, charging forward with fists clenched, and ordering her to get down from there immediately. But John held Florine firmly and dodged the prince's blows, who demanded an apology. Still, the knight kept his cool, reminding the young master that violence wasn't allowed there. Seeing the bodyguard wouldn't budge, Gerard grumbled that the knight was protecting an albino and disrespecting him, but John coldly refused the accusation, clarifying he wasn't taking sides, he just wanted to prevent accidents between the two children. Asking him once more to calm down. Totally annoyed, the prince stomped on the floor and ranted against the girl's mockery, asking how she dared mock the kingdom's second son. But to Florine, the scene just looked like a childish tantrum. Honestly, what could the boy do? What would his next mean nickname for her be? The boy was finishing his speech when he bellowed that the girl had a family that backed her up and a great track record. But, realizing what he'd said, Gerard was left speechless. That wasn't what he'd meant to say. That's when Florine remembered this had happened, because Pom Pom was equipped with a kindness filter that turned all the insults directed at her into sweet, cute words. Having a lot of fun with it, the girl mentally mocked the fact that such a pathetic boy would never stand a chance as a romantic protagonist. But her over-the-top reaction makes John worry about the MC's mental state. Still stressed, Gerard blamed the girl for his fury, shouting that he already hated the food in his room in that mansion and that her presence only irritated him further. Hearing the complaint about the dishes, Florine remembered the complaints from earlier, and staring straight at the prince, she asked him directly whether he was the one who'd thrown the pudding in the trash in front of the cooks. Bothered by the girl's fury, Gerard felt a pang of guilt, but there was no way he'd be scared of an albino skunk, even if she was looking at him in a strange way. So he puffed out his chest and answered defiantly that yes, he'd thrown the food away, and asked what she intended to do about it, claiming the chefs shouldn't have dared serve him that kind of meal in the first place. Hearing that, Jep cried, hurt by the prince's criticism, while Florine looked at the boy with total contempt. It was disgusting to think he was still a candidate to be heir. So she shot back at the prince's words, saying he might be in line as an heir, but he was a terrible person, because he wasn't just an ungrateful boy to the staff who'd cooked for him, he also had the nerve to throw the food away in front of them, which was even more despicable. And she ordered him to reflect on the gravity of his actions, which makes the little guy's face turn red with rage. Feeling humiliated in front of the servants, Gerard clenched his fists and asked how an inferior creature dared lecture him like that in front of the staff. Saying she thought too highly of herself, the boy made it clear that after their marriage, he'd lock her up in an isolated tower so she'd spend the rest of her life begging for his love. Finally, John butted in and protested against the prince's threat while covering Florine's face with his hand to protect her. But the girl pushed the knight's hand away with a touch, indicating those words didn't affect her. She remembered the original novel had something about the boy's backstory. Gerard's father had many mistresses, and indeed, he sent them to isolated towers to beg for mercy. But the prince had promised never to repeat his father's behavior, wanting only Rahin's love, which now the girl knew was pure lies. Once more, John intervened furiously, calling the young master's behavior unacceptable, and promising to report the incident personally to the head of the family. Except this only makes Gerard even angrier at the guard's threat, asking whether he'd be reported over some random creature. Florine crossed her arms. She understood the prince's spoiled upbringing justified that explosive behavior, finding his threats laughable. Even so, he deserved to be punished. So determined to put an end to the argument, the girl smiled mockingly and asked who said she'd marry him, which leaves him confused. The girl continues, reminding him he was just one candidate among many, and calling him an idiot. Seeing the boy grind his teeth in rage, Florine thought the fact that he was swallowing his pride was out of pure fear of losing his chance to become the clan head. Or maybe he was too intimidated by John, afraid of causing problems for the Derblians. Realizing direct confrontations wouldn't lead anywhere, she tapped the bodyguard and ordered them to leave. A request the knight obeyed respectfully, settling her on his head and walking right past the prince toward the exit. As she sprawled on John's head, Florine remembered that in the book, the awakening of Gerard's powers as an alpha and his evolution into a promising heir had happened thanks to the royal family's intervention. But that didn't matter. It'd be better if he and Raheen just played house. However, Gerard had murder in his eyes after that humiliation, and he exploded with hatred at having been humiliated in front of the servants. Using a magic orb, he guaranteed he'd teach the girl a lesson. He asks the girl to wait, and before anyone could react, a small spirit in the shape of an eagle appeared, grabbed Florine from behind and dragged her through the air, which makes John panic and try to grab her back, but it was already too late. Using the ice orb to control the spirit and keep the girl suspended, Gerard mocked the situation, claiming this was her punishment for underestimating him. While the eagle flew in circles, making Florine cry in terror at the prince's madness, John was furious, identifying the creature as a wind spirit and asking how the young master dared use magic against the young lady, warning that the improper use of the royal guardian spirit would bring serious punishment and ordering him to stop immediately. But Gerard just shrugged, claiming he had no intention of stopping. Florine closed her eyes, terrified by the boy's cruelty, and begged for salvation in her thoughts. John drew his sword immediately, declaring he had express orders from the patriarch to guarantee the young lady's absolute safety and warning he'd take that spirit down by force if necessary. Faced with the blade, Gerard hesitated for an instant, but kept up his arrogance, asking whether the knight would dare point a weapon at him over an albino. Then, he dispelled the magic in disgust, saying the girl wasn't up to his standards and ordering the knight to fetch her back. Florine fell into John's arms in pain and very dizzy, but the humiliation lit her fury, and determined to take revenge on the prince, she leapt from the guard's arms and flew at Gerard, right at the moment he turned to leave. The attack catches the little boy by surprise, and a sharp scream of pain echoed through the kitchen when Florine sank her sharp teeth right into the prince's ear. Gerard shrieked in pain and tried to pull the girl off by her tail, ordering her to let go, but Florine bit down even harder, making it clear she wouldn't let go and reminding him he was the one who'd started the fight. The prince grabbed the skunk's body and squeezed it hard to try to free himself, throwing poor Pom-Pom on the floor in the process. Now John panicked at the children's fight and begged them both to stop immediately, but Florine's fury kept her completely focused on her revenge against the boy, ignoring the pleas while the prince screamed in pain. Outside, two maids peeked at the chaos with worry. Even Jep trembled in terror, begging the two to stop before they got badly hurt. That's when someone scolded the two, ordering them to stop that nonsense. It was Lafrien, who had a severe expression on his face, demanding to know the meaning of that uproar. Faced with the assistant's authority, the children let go immediately, and the man ordered the two to follow him. They go to the infirmary, and the doctor bandages the prince's ear carefully to protect it. Lafrey grumbled that he couldn't believe those two had been brawling like ruffians in the middle of the kitchen. Quickly, Gerard turned to Florine, accusing her of the attack and promising to report her to his own father. But the girl merely looked at him with arrogance and let out a sigh, judging that the boy hadn't learned his lesson to be acting that way in front of Lafrien. The assistant sighed in frustration and asked the doctor about the health condition of the two children, but the woman reassured the man, confirming both had only minor scratches and nothing serious. Relieved by the diagnosis, Lafrien asked the doctor to leave them alone for a moment, and she agreed, only asking the assistant to go easy on the kids. Before leaving, she smiled, asking them to call her when they were done. As soon as the four were alone in the room, Lafrien adjusted his glasses and said that, since both were fine, it was time to hear the explanations. Florine trembled in terror upon noticing the fury on the assistant's face. John even tried to step in to explain what happened, but Lafrien blocked the knight, making it clear the explanation had to come directly from the two involved in the fight. Florine quickly calculated that the prince would try to play the victim to blame her, which would end up hurting not just her but also the knight and the cooks. So she had to find a way to turn the situation in her favor before her rival said anything. Annoyed, Gerard questioned why he should give explanations to the assistant, declaring he'd report the case directly to the head of the family. But Laforian reminded the young master he was sorely mistaken if he thought he had the right to interfere in the patriarch's schedule. Arrogant as ever, the prince turned his face away haughtily, saying his blood kinship guaranteed him that right. The assistant reflected for a moment, and turned to Florine, who remained head down on the table, asking if the young lady had anything to declare. Seizing the opening, the girl started crying fake tears and apologized for causing so much trouble. Of course, her docile manner impressed Laforian, who praised the girl's understanding of what she'd done wrong. and he launched into a long lecture about how physical violence was a barbaric act that reduced humans to the level of animals, arguing that only reason set them apart from wild beasts. Even though it was a lecture, the girl noticed his tone was gentle, which was a good sign. Next, Lafrian questioned why a child as understanding as her had acted that way, and Florine started her defense by revealing that the prince had thrown her food in the trash, which made Gerard grind his teeth in rage. Curious about the revelation, the assistant wanted to know the details of the story. So Florine explained that the boy had taken the pudding, but she was interrupted when the golem started explaining that the boy had thrown the pudding the cooks had worked so hard to prepare right in the trash, and that this had triggered the girl's fury, setting off his insults. The girl didn't know how she'd activated the translator out of nowhere, but she was mentally grateful it had happened. She nodded to the assistant, guaranteeing there were witnesses to the incident, while Pom Pom faithfully reproduced the recording of the prince's arrogant words, exposing the moment he admitted to throwing the pudding away and dared Florine to do something about it, which left the MC startled, since she didn't even know he could record anything. Right after, the golem played the most serious part of the recording, revealing Gerard's threat to lock the girl in an isolated tower after the marriage, so she'd beg for his love. Faced with the revelation of his own words, the prince was completely paralyzed at having been caught red-handed. Faced with the recording revealed by Pom Pom, Lafrian furrowed his brow coldly and called out the boy, scolding him severely. Feeling guilty and unable to believe what was happening, the prince clenched his fists and tried to shift all the blame onto Florine, claiming the audio was fake and that the girl had made it all up herself. However, the Night John promptly offered to testify, assuring the assistant the recording was real and that he himself was a witness to the incident, which made the prince revolt against the guard. Meanwhile, Florine had to admit that twist exceeded her expectations. Certain her rival was finished, she shot a cynical smile at Gerard, who was falling apart trying to defend himself. Taking advantage of the moment, Florine presented even more evidence against him, accusing him of having used a magical creature to attack her. Pom Pom caught the girl's thoughts and translated, reporting that a wind spirit had snatched Florine off John's head to abuse her. The assistant's eyes went wide in pure shock at the revelation, and he pointed out that the young master had used the guardian spirit granted by the royalty of Leekenbeam to attack the clan's future daughter-in-law. The boy stammers, trying to find some excuse to save himself. On the verge of tears and deeply desperate, he complained that the girl had laughed at him first, asking why everyone was against him. But Lafrian shot back harshly, stating the prince showed not the slightest remorse for his mistakes and warning that the improper use of the royal spirit against a member of Driblidiane could trigger a war between the two nations. Noticing the seriousness of the assistant's tone, Gerard backed off for an instant, but soon raised his voice with arrogance to argue, asking what harm there was in teaching an albino skunk a lesson, claiming the girl was trying to attack a noble. In that same instant, the infirmary door was flung open, and an imposing voice declared that the boy really had gone too far. Florine was dumbfounded as she looked toward the entrance, and recognized the figure of the patriarch accompanied by Kiraxis. Everyone in the room bowed their heads in respect and greeted the great head of the family, as well as greeting Kiraxis as the future young master of Driblidiane. With no time for formalities, the mage questioned his father about how he intended to resolve that mess. From the newcomers' reactions, they were already aware of the whole story, so our girl knew she needed to land the final blow right there. Upon spotting the patriarch, Gerard ran toward him seeking support, crying out for the chief and saying he was hurt, pointing at his own injuries. However, Florine had already gotten ahead of him. She flew toward the head of the family, who opened his arms gently to receive her, calling out to her affectionately. Noticing the little one's bandaged body, the leader asked worriedly if she'd gotten hurt too. With tears in her eyes, she confirmed she had, but she faked immediate concern for the patriarch, saying she was going to blow on his wound first, which left the man very confused. But she soon pointed at a stain on his shirt, begging tearfully that he not be hurt like that. She knew she had great skills for being adored by such an important man. Settled in the leader's arms, she lamented falsely, claiming the patriarch's pain represented Dreisveile's own pain. Deep down, she knew Gerard's arrogant behavior came from pride in his royal blood. The head of the family smiled and pointed to his own shoulder, asking whether she was worried about the bloodstain on his collar. Faced with the confirmation, he dispelled any tension and praised Florine as an admirable child, assuring her that blood wasn't his and that she didn't need to worry. Confirming the patriarch valued someone's potential far more than their influence, Gerard watched the scene enraged. Pointing his finger directly at the skunk, he demanded the leader take his side and ordered him not to fall for that trick, accusing the girl for what had happened to him. Florine looked down with total contempt, scorning the spoiled child's inability to understand the situation. The head of the family, for his part, had already made his decision. He looked at the prince and declared he'd be brief, ordering the boy to remain confined in the heir's dormitory until he genuinely repented for his actions. After hearing the sentence, Gerard refused to back down and shot back, questioning the decision and saying his own injuries had been caused by the audacity of that albino. He threatened that if his father, the king of Lycanbium, found out about the assault, the affront wouldn't go unanswered. But the patriarch raised an eyebrow at the audacity and scolded him, warning that if the boy insisted on challenging the order, he'd be immediately stripped of his heir status and sent back to his beloved kingdom. The punishment left the prince completely shocked and at a loss. That boy was very stupid for daring to threaten the leader of Drublane using Lycanbium's name. She seized the chance to make a mocking face at her rival, mentally suggesting he go back home if he missed it so much. Caraxes turned to the girl with a discreet smile and asked to hand the girl over to him, saying she must be in shock and needed to rest. As soon as he held her, Caraxes began a teleportation spell, and before disappearing, Florine waved cheerfully at the head of the family, wishing him well. The gesture moved the leader, who murmured to himself about the future daughter-in-law's graciousness in being so well-mannered. Finally, the two arrive in the room. Looking around, the girl recognized her quarters and wondered whether there was really any need to use magic for a trip that could have been done on foot. Right after, a thought struck her, making her wonder whether he'd used teleportation because he was actually worried about her. Caraxes settled her on the bed gently and comforted her, commenting the day had been long and asking her to lie down and rest. Awkwardly, she answered. She felt a bit of pain, but it was fine, consoling herself with the fact that Gerard had been punished. Hearing the comment, the boy stiffened, pointing out the prince really did deserve the punishment, and that in fact the penalty should have been much harsher. With the anger already out of her system, she draws closer, stating everything was fine and arguing that since she had no intention of marrying Gerard whatsoever, she just had to not see him again for the situation to be resolved. Caraxes agrees and sits on the bed, comforting the girl by reminding her there were other candidates besides that spoiled prince, guaranteeing she didn't need to worry because there'd surely be someone suitable among them, and the girl could hardly wait to meet them. However, the young master pondered that the way things were going wouldn't be so simple, and warned that the next meetings would face some delays. Faced with Florine's curiosity about the reason, Caraxes explained the children were scattered across other regions. One of them had an exceptional skill with the sword, and because of that, was studying at the Officers' Academy. Based on her prior knowledge of the novel, Florine immediately deduced the candidate at the military academy was Dante. Caraxes continued the account, explaining the other suitor was a shark beast man belonging to the Magic Kingdom's royal family, and that since he needed a specific environment for his development, he lived in the royal palace. Surely he was talking about Yuri, remembering that the imperial royalty corresponded to the shark tribe of the Helicroprian family, and that among the heirs who didn't belong to the Sword Tiger clan, he was the only option. As for the last candidate, Caraxes hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to reveal the information, commenting the boy hardly deserved to be mentioned. But the hesitation made Florine anxious, wondering whether one of the suitors had already been ruled out. After reflecting a bit, the young master revealed the details about the last member, explaining he was Gerard's older brother and the legitimate crown prince of Lycanbium, but that since he carried the responsibility of leading his own nation, he'd soon give up his succession rights in Drublane. Florine started to grasp the whole picture, deducing that the Lycanbium clan had sent the second son, Gerard, precisely because it couldn't send the firstborn. Without waiting for the girl's reaction, Caraxes assured her that, aside from the complications with Gerard's brother, she'd eventually meet the other candidates and ordered her to seek him out or the patriarch if any new problem came up. Hearing his words, the little girl was surprised, since the master seemed much friendlier, wondering whether his kindness was only because she was hurt. Noticing the girl's silence, Caraxes called out to her, guaranteeing he'd instruct the knights better so bad situations like this wouldn't happen again. Besides, he warned that the knight John would be punished for having failed in his duty to protect her. The news shocked Florine, who reacted stubbornly and questioned why the guard of all people would be punished. But Caraxes considered the question unnecessary, arguing that failing to protect the noble was already a crime in itself. Disagreeing completely with that rigid logic, Florine decided to ask Pom-Pom for help to clear the night. She tapped the golem's head twice to activate the translator and the creature reproduced the girl's thoughts, arguing that John was just an ordinary escort knight, so it'd be impossible for the guard to openly defy a legitimate heir of the clan. And she added that the simple act of John having drawn his sword in the girl's defense was already grounds for him to receive severe punishment, concluding the knight hadn't failed out of negligence, but out of a total lack of legal authority to act against royalty. Those sincere words seemed to touch Caraxes' heart of stone, since Florine insisted on her defense, arguing that punishing John without having granted him the necessary authority to intervene was a grave mistake. Faced with the girl's protests and firm posture, Caraxes vaguely recalled a figure from his past. He could see traces of his late sister in the little skunk's determination. He murmured to himself about how he saw more and more similarities between the two, leaving Florine confused about the comment, but the guy played it off, shaking his head and saying it was nothing important, asking right after whether she really insisted that John be spared the punishment, which the little one confirms, guaranteeing the knight hadn't made any mistake. Caraxes smiled in agreement and asked her not to be irritated anymore, guaranteeing he'd understood the request. But the girl was surprised by his reaction. It was truly fascinating to see the guy laughing like that. Getting back on track, Caraxes said he'd brought the girl to the room because he had something to tell her, and the young master explained her studies would begin the next day. Besides, he'd found a way to guarantee an official identity for her. The boy explains that someone had agreed to be her adoptive mother, but there was a small problem with it. The news about the new identity left Florine totally euphoric. It couldn't be possible, and Caraxes crossed his arms, not understanding so much resistance. But the girl hesitated and asked how anyone would accept an albino skunk of completely unknown origin as part of their family. The boy smiled and assured her that, after some searching, he'd found the ideal person for the role. Despite that guarantee, Florine couldn't shake the feeling of suspicion, wondering whether all that generosity wasn't too suspicious, even considering the help she'd given the clan. Suspicious, the MC worked up her courage and confronted Caraxes, commenting she'd been curious about something since earlier. She continued, reminding him he'd taken her side at the meeting, lied to the council claiming she was a saint, and he'd even given her the golem pom-pom, which was strange to say the least. So she decided to get straight to the point and asked why the guy was being so nice to her like that. She was terrified the mage was secretly scheming against her. Caraxes smiled at the suspicion and repeated to the skunk that classes would begin the next day and that her identity was secured with a very dignified adoptive mother. However, he revealed the woman was hidden in the Yantarosa mountain range, which would force him to set off on a journey to find her. And that revelation leaves the girl shocked by the location, because that mountain range was formed by the petrified body of a dragon and was famous for completely nullifying any kind of magic. Florine soon worried about the dangers of the journey, considering it madness for the young master to risk himself like that over her. Noticing the girl's concern, Caraxes asked whether she was really worried about his safety, thanking her for the care. The MC remained in shock about the whole thing of him giving her a real identity, which she didn't quite understand his aim with. He asks what she meant, so the MC tried to explain her fear, repeating that no family would accept an albino like her without getting something in return. She knew all that kindness from the guy needed a logical explanation, asking whether he expected something more from her. She really didn't understand all that care. And she was smart enough to know everything had a price. She remembered her old life, a day when she was curled up on the floor. After her mother's passing, her aunt invited her to come live with her, and of course she accepted. It's not like she had another choice, but the girl soon discovered the welcome had only happened so the woman could keep the life insurance money her mother had left behind. The hard reality of childhood made her incapable of accepting these free displays of affection. Florine was afraid Caraxes' kindness would cost too high a price in the future. If she got used to this gentle treatment and ended up mistreated in the end after all, she'd be even more miserable. That's why, as strange as it seems, she'd feel much safer if there was some interest behind his actions. Curious, Caraxes thought about the girl's question, and amid murmurs, he ended up revealing that the real reason for his dedication was the fact she looked a lot like his sister, but the girl was still confused. Even so, he smiled, stating there was no extraordinary reason and justifying that, since she was part of his collection of rarities, it was his duty to look after her. Something Florine shot back immediately, refusing to be treated like an object. Ignoring that, the young master commented that, although he had no plans to marry, he considered that having a daughter like her wouldn't be a bad idea. And our girl argues she wasn't his daughter either, but the official daughter-in-law of that family. He stares at her deeply and asks whether the girl was really curious to know why he hadn't yet revealed her fake identity to kick her out of the mansion. But all he had to say about it was that he acted this way because he felt like it. Which left Florine dumbfounded. What kind of answer was that? That definitely wasn't a good reason to treat someone so well. But she remembered that in the original novel, Caraxes ended up taking up the dark arts out of pure boredom, concluding it was impossible to find logic in that man's actions. A pat on the head brought the girl back to reality, and the boy asked her to stop overthinking the things he did, guaranteeing that, no matter what anyone there said, she remained the daughter-in-law of the Dribbling clan. The reassurance left Florine surprised and at a loss, realizing he'd noticed her anguish all along. Caraxes stroked the skunk's belly affectionately and asked her to rest, wishing the little one a good night's sleep after that tiring day. But this only leaves the poor thing even more confused about the guy's mood swings. Besides, the sun was still shining outside, so it was way too early for her to sleep. The moment the young master turned to leave the room, announcing he was already heading off, the girl panicked and called him back, explaining she still needed to talk about one last detail. And at last she asks whether she hadn't been chosen as the family's official daughter-in-law yet. The unexpected question made Caraxes freeze in place. After a brief silence, he explained that, to obtain the official title of daughter-in-law, the girl would still need to receive formal recognition from the Duchess. And he makes it clear the woman had gone into complete isolation a year ago, making any meeting impossible at that moment. But he assured her the situation would be resolved soon, ordering the girl once more to rest without worries. The answer made Florine more and more curious, because if the Duchess had been isolated for a year, that meant it had started when Ariadne died. Inanna Abigail Riplian was the 18th Duchess of the clan, as well as a great manipulator of earth spirits and mother of Caraxes and Ariadne. In the original story, the grief over losing her daughter had kept the Duchess away from all clan affairs for a long period. which meant she wouldn't show the slightest interest in choosing a new daughter-in-law at that moment. And Florine knew that trying to force a closeness with the woman right then would be a mistake that only create more distance from her, so she'd need a better plan, concluding it would be best not to meddle in others' affairs to avoid getting on the woman's bad side. Early the next morning, Florine began her studies as promised, receiving Lafrienne as her tutor. The assistant reintroduced himself formally as Lafrienne Gerbites, revealing his title of Baron and his animal form of an owl. He even thought about asking how the girl was doing, but considering the girl's well-rested appearance, he realized it wouldn't be necessary. In the end, the MC had slept from yesterday afternoon until morning. Finally, he turned to begin the lesson, leaving the girl even more excited. The Drip family was known for being very good at trades, which meant that if you gave them nothing, you shouldn't expect to receive anything. So to integrate into that family, it was essential to possess great ambition and a strategist's mind. Besides, the man explains that Driblian chose its prey carefully and never left free escape routes once a hunt began, making the girl conclude that their half-done jobs were frowned upon. In fact, they were even harmful to the family. Despite her initial nervousness at it being her first official class, Florine felt relieved upon realizing the tutor focused on very obvious and realistic teachings, which was a very good thing. But the man drew attention to a very important detail which got the girl excited. He held a very fancy weapon in his hands, explaining that this was the latest model developed by the clan, designed to convert magical energy into high-powered bullets, highlighting the weapon as Dribliane's main luxury product, and announcing that the young daughter-in-law would also learn to use it in the future. And just that possibility already makes the girl's eyes sparkle. But Lafrienne explained the practical training would only happen after the exact confirmation of the girl's age, explaining the clan prohibited the use of firearms by children under 10 years old. As a safe alternative for the experience, he presented some bullets from older models, warning that she should only observe for her own safety. Examining the silver bullets in the tutor's hand, Florine pointed out the cinnamon smell of the object, knowing any hybrid would identify the scent immediately. So Lafrienne clarified that, thanks to Caraxes's technical innovations, the clan had developed magical ammunition that solved that problem completely. But the little one had a question. She wanted to know whether the end of the war with Spring's arrival wouldn't drastically reduce weapon sales and end up compromising Dorilemain's financial support. Her reasoning made the assistant smile before asking who told her people would stop buying weapons just because the war had ended. Lafrienne asked the girl whether she knew the use of weapons beyond the obvious purposes of attack, and after reflecting for a moment, Florine answered that the other purpose of weapons would be defense. Something the tutor agrees with, clarifying that Dorilemain's true strategy didn't consist of starting confrontations, but of profiting by selling preparation and security against unforeseen events to other nations. After all, the end of the sword era had already arrived, and the rise of firearm supremacy and the nobility's education guaranteed the clan's monopoly in that new market. Florine understood the vision of the future the family had, and the assistant comments he was very impressed with the MC, which was a surprise to Florine since after all, the guy hadn't liked her much at first. Even so, now he seemed very excited as he said she'd understood the clan's plans perfectly, which meant the duchy's future looked promising if she was in it. Apparently, she and every Dribliane were the perfect match, and the little one could hardly wait to learn to use a real weapon. The assistant interrupted the girl's daydreaming to introduce the day's last topic, and Florine was surprised to see a family tree placed on the table, but the tutor explained the lesson would cover the clan's heirs, that is, the young lady's potential husbands, making it clear she'd only need to memorize the 3 names that had obtained permission to reside in the main building. The prospect of meeting the boys excited Florine, who saw in it a chance to scheme her future plans. However, the girl's joy was interrupted when Lafrienne revealed there was a small problem, because given the current political scenario, the most promising candidate on the list was none other than Prince Gerard. The news made Florine's heart stop right there, and she screams in disbelief. There was no way that snot-nosed kid was the best candidate. This would surely force her to constantly live with the boy until he gave up on the dispute. Lafrienne adjusted his glasses seriously and made it clear that if the girl really wanted to get rid of him, she'd have to come up with a strategy, because given the prince's pride, he'd surely hold grudges and cause serious problems for the MC in the future. So it'd be much better to smooth him over before that happened. But Florine questioned what she'd do if she couldn't get close to the guy, to which he answers that, in that case, the next day's meals could come poisoned. The girl is startled by how naturally the guy said those terrible things, but Lafrienne reminded her right after that. Before leaving, Caraxes had guaranteed Prince Gerard wouldn't do anything crazy, and just the mention of the young master was enough to make Florine recall the guidance she'd received about how he'd find her adoptive mother no matter the cost, which makes the girl spiral into even more despair. If Caraxes was a deterrent to Gerard's wickedness, him not being there at the palace would be terrible. She knew very well there were few people on her side there, so with Caraxes gone, the nobles who acted secretly with his presence could start putting their plans of attack into action at any moment. Worried about how she'd survive until her protectors return, given the real risk of poisoning, our girl even considered asking Jep to bring her meals personally, or even start eating in the kitchen itself to avoid traps. Nervous, the little one asks what she'd do without her young master, to which Lafrienne answers amid a sigh that they couldn't do anything about the boy's absence. However, he made it clear it was his responsibility to help the MC with anything she needed. So, considering she was in new territory, it'd be good to give some general guidance. He starts by reminding her the Magic Kingdom maintained a strategic military alliance with the Kingdom of Lycanbim for the supply of war provisions and to contain the Holy Nation's advances. Continuing, the assistant explained that, since it was an indestructible pact, stripping Gerard of his inheritance rights directly would be a nearly impossible task, especially considering the boy's considerable strength, which makes the poor thing despair at the idea of him wanting revenge for her bite. And Lafrien adds that it'd be truly terrible if the two married, because the Lycanbium lineage had historically governed through arrogance and prejudice, picking albinos as their main targets of persecution. After hearing all this, the rest of Florine's optimism went down the drain because she was now totally certain the prince would never leave her in peace if he took control. The assistant observed the girl's silent suffering for a moment, before asking directly whether she wanted to get rid of Gerard's candidacy once and for all. Florine hesitated for a second and tried to form an answer, but Lafrien interrupted her immediately, assuring her he knew a foolproof method to eliminate the rival. The promise filled Florine with enthusiasm, making her ask what she had to do. Finally, the assistant revealed a secret to Florine, explaining that if she achieved a great feat, she'd earn the right to choose her own future. Because 10 suitors were too many, so the idea was for the girl to have the power to cut that number in half. But only if she accomplished something so grand that it forced everyone to acknowledge her power, because only then would the patriarch grant her the right to choose. Florine repeated the condition out loud, trying to take it all in. Provoking her, Lafrien asks whether she didn't feel confident in her bets. And refusing to accept failure, the little one declared she'd surely prove her worth and earn that right. The man smiles, showing extreme satisfaction with the answer and stating he looked forward to the young lady's next steps, and she smiled back and guaranteed she'd work very hard to reach her goals. Riding the tutor's good mood, the girl admitted there was another thing she'd like to know. She wanted to understand what would happen if the other clan members didn't accept Gerard's elimination, asking whether anyone would be unhappy about him losing the chance to become the family head. But Lafrien made it clear she didn't even need to worry about that, clarifying that the disqualified heirs received the title of Marquis of the Frontier and retained the right to send their own children to compete for the leadership in the future. That information was totally new to Florine, who was impressed by the system, judging that the opportunity given to the next generations would prevent revolts and keep the candidates satisfied. The assistant added that obviously there were always those who refused to follow tradition and tried to seize power through brute force, something Florine had already imagined, since it would be impossible for everyone to accept defeat peacefully. However, Lafrien assured her that in those cases, the clan used a specific mediator to resolve the disputes, bringing relief to the little one. The tutor continued explaining the eliminated heirs took on positions of great importance in the family structure, and that the majority accepted these conditions and caused no problems, especially since they understood these rules represented the will of their own ancestors who'd stated the strongest should be the one to lead the house after a fierce competition. But the MC questioned what would happen if a daughter proved stronger than the male heirs. And that question put Lafrien in a tight spot, praising the girl for having such an important doubt. He recalled that tradition restricted the position of head to the male sons, but revealed there had been a single person capable of breaking that rule. But the assistant fell silent for a moment, as if thinking about whether or not to reveal who'd accomplished that feat. Baton, he returns to his account, revealing the exception had been Lady Ariadne, Caraxes's older sister. He detailed that, in life, the young woman had proven such extraordinary capabilities that on the occasion when the patriarch's designated wife had to choose one of the candidates after the previous head's death, all the other competitors decided to voluntarily withdraw their candidacies in the face of her superiority. The revelation left Florine speechless, reflecting that, even though she already knew of Ariadne's talent, hearing the accounts of those who surrounded her brought a whole new dimension. Before she could extend her thoughts, Lafrien commented he'd lost track of time a bit and apologized, warning he had to leave since it was already very late. Only then did Florine realize she'd taken up too much of the tutor's time, and as a sign of gratitude for the help during the classes, she decided to reward him, holding out a caramel candy, which leaves him surprised. After all, that was the little one's favorite kind of candy, which she confirms, saying it was just a thank you for all the help he'd given her that day. Lafrien seemed awkward, pointing out that the value of a gift was relative, but he recognized that candy represented something very important to the young lady. At last, he accepted the treat and guaranteed he'd never forget the value of that gesture. Content with her morning of studies, Florine hurried the tutor along so he wouldn't be late, warning she'd stay in the room reviewing the lesson content. So Lafrien said goodbye, thanking her for her understanding and promising to pass the girl's words along to the knight John. Alone, Florine returned to her plans about managing the heirs who'd be her suitors, but to do that, she first needed to understand the family's family tree. Curious upon noticing Caraxes had no descendants due to his vow of purity, the little one decides to jump to Ariadne. However, she freezes upon finding an unknown name below Ariadne's lineage. After all, she only knew Dante and Yuri, but the document listed someone called Ion, whom our girl had never heard of at all. Moments later, Evangeline carried Florine through the corridors, accompanied by the personal maid of the Duchess Inanna. The maid's severe posture left Florine extremely anxious, wondering why she'd been summoned so suddenly. Already fearing the Duchess would reject her and kick her out of the mansion upon seeing her. Noticing the little one's nervousness, Evangeline comforted her, assuring her she didn't need to worry, since the Duchess only wanted to meet her and greet her formally. But Florine insisted the woman might hate what she saw. Still, the nanny made it clear that wouldn't happen, praising the girl's impeccable look and guaranteeing the Duchess would surely have an excellent first impression. Overcome with anxiety, Florine gulped just from hearing the maid announce they'd arrived at the Duchess's quarters. The staffer warned Florine beforehand about her mistress's delicate health, ordering her to take the utmost care not to do anything that might displease the woman, something that hadn't even crossed the MC's mind. Finally, she opens the dreaded door and already hears the Duchess's orders for them to enter the room. The little one couldn't contain her curiosity, charmed by the woman's room, but something draws her attention more: a magnificent and enormous chandelier, very fancy. Besides, all the room's decor was extravagant, worthy of a duchess. But even though it was her first time entering there, Florine felt something extremely familiar in the environment. The maid announced the girl's arrival seriously, and Inanna, who was drinking her tea, raised her gaze and identified the little one as the child brought by Caraxes. Still kind of nervous, Florine greeted the noblewoman timidly and awkwardly, making it clear it was an honor to meet her. Faced with the woman's initial silence, the girl's anxiety grew even more. But to her surprise, the Duchess soon smiled and asked her to just call her Inanna, dispensing with formalities. The noblewoman explained she'd wanted to meet her for a long time out of pure curiosity about her personality, justifying that the meeting hadn't happened earlier only because she'd been in a coma until the day before. Florine asked politely whether the Duchess was feeling well, and the woman smiled, guaranteeing she was much better and inviting the girl to come closer so they could talk. Now that she was in front of her, the MC noticed the lady was much friendlier than she'd anticipated. Turning to the nanny, Inanna greeted Evangeline, commenting it'd been a long time since they'd seen each other. With a sad, nostalgic look, the woman recalled the times when the staffer cared for her late daughter Ariadne, admitting she'd never imagined a scenario like the current one. The comment made Florine understand the nanny had been Ariadne's personal caretaker, concluding she was probably suffering a lot over the girl's death. Inanna drew Florine's attention, commenting that now Evangeline must be her nanny, which the skunk confirms. Then she asked whether the girl understood why the patriarch had made that decision. Faced with the little one's doubt, the Duchess clarified that since Evangeline had accompanied Ariadne from childhood up to the moment she'd taken on the position of young master, the family head's decision to transfer the late heir's inner circle to Florine represented a clear demonstration of power and political prestige within the mansion. The explanation made Florine realize the magnitude of the honor she was receiving. She already had a hunch, but now she was certain there were factions within the Drybliane family itself, and that this only went unnoticed because the head of the family was still in good health. But deep down, all those men were desperate to make money off the terrible situation they were in. So the people who supported Lady Ariadne had given her the job of protecting their interests. With this information, the little one states it was an honor, promising she'd do her best to live up to the patriarch's expectations. Inanna smiled and praised the girl's intelligence for catching the hidden meaning of her words so quickly, but distracted by a plate of sweets on the table, Florine wondered to herself whether she'd be allowed to eat. Finding the cakes delicious, the Duchess wondered out loud where Caraxes had found such a peculiar child, keeping Florine in silence. Honestly, she thought it was better the Duchess didn't know. Next, Inanna asked directly whether the girl didn't feel frustrated about still being unable to turn into a human due to her albino condition, and Florine sighed and confirmed the sadness, claiming she could never feel the flow of magic energy in her little body. The noblewoman comforted her, explaining that IQ-less energy filled the whole world and that transformation would be possible if she learned to harvest magic directly from the air, pondering that, although the process was much harder for an albino, it wasn't impossible. The revelation left Florine full of hope. Inanna promised to send a specialized tutor to guide her on the magic flow, and she even offered to help her personally with any doubts if her health allowed. Watching that, Florine even felt pain at seeing such a dear person suffering so much. She couldn't even imagine what it was like to lose a child, but seeing Inanna's situation, she could get an idea. She didn't know how, but she felt the two had known each other for a long time, and a scene of Ariadne talking to her mother comes to mind. In the vision, the young woman with short hair happily showed her mother that the southern myrtle flowers had bloomed, and the platinum-haired woman smiled, considering the event a good omen. Noticing the skunk's startle, the Duchess got extremely worried, asking what had happened. Florine even let the cake fall to the floor, overcome by the terror of that memory that seemed to have been lived by her herself. In the continuation of the vision, the young woman said goodbye to her mother, asking her to take care of her health, and the woman reminded her daughter that this would be the final battle, demanding she return so they could spend time together, receiving the heir's smiling promise, sealing the farewell with an affectionate hug. But her next vision was full of plates shattering while the mother screamed that this couldn't be happening. The lady tore at her hair. She couldn't believe her daughter had passed away and wished the universe would take her along with the young woman. She cried compulsively, while the pot of plants both of them cultivated slowly withered. Florine recovered the memory completely in that instant, realizing she knew where she'd seen that room before. In reality, it was in that very room that she'd taken possession of that skunk body for the first time, witnessing all of the Duchess's suffering with her own eyes. The intensity of the memories leaves the girl nearly breathless. How was that possible? She'd watched everything that happened in that room with her own eyes. Our girl was getting more and more dazed, until finally she passed out on top of the table. It was as if she were suffocating with so many memories. She remembered Ariadne and her brother, together. In a kind of magical recording, Ariadne smiled and greeted her mother, predicting her surprise at finding that recording in the future, accompanied by Caraxes's nod in agreement. In the scene, Ariadne handled some magical dice and suggested it'd be better if she left them there for now, but her brother comments it'd be good for her to take them to the battlefield as protection against serious injuries. Even so, the girl firmly refused, arguing they shouldn't use artifacts that hadn't been tested beforehand. And the boy insisted, explaining several people were already using them and that they could amplify magic energy up to 10 times. But Ariadne pondered the unknown risk of the price of all that power, considering the gamble could cost them their own lives. Besides, she reminded him that, after years of searching, they'd only managed to find 3 units, including the die given by Rahin, and that losing the artifacts in the war would worsen the situation against the Holy Nation, which also badly wanted to get its hands on those relics. Caraxes accepts his sister's arguments, but asks where she planned to hide the objects. So Ariadne reveals she intended to hide them in a place easily accessible to their mother, but which she'd never consider discarding, choosing a secret compartment inside the vanity the patriarch had made as a wedding gift for the Duchess, commenting it was her daughter herself who'd made the compartment without anyone's permission, which left Caraxes truly surprised. The sister asks him to keep everything secret until their mother discovered it on her own. The boy accepts the pact in the face of her insistence, making Ariadne laugh and praise her little brother's obedience, and at last she places the dice there, hoping their mother would find the relic safely. The dream came to an end and Florine woke up dazed in her room, making Evangeline and Inanna jump, asking desperately whether the girl was all right. Florine looked around dazed, asking where she was, to which Inanna clarified she was in her room, explaining she'd fainted and been examined by the mansion's doctor. The nanny added that the doctor hadn't found any physical symptom, but asked whether the little one felt all right, since she'd fainted out of nowhere. And the MC explains she was feeling fine, hiding the strangeness regarding the memory that had awakened, wondering whether she should tell Lady Inanna, since it might all be true. Determined to act, she came up with a strategy, quickly turning toward Inanna's vanity and exclaiming in surprise that the spot was emitting a glittering shine, something that left the Duchess curious. And Florine lied, guaranteeing she'd seen something shining the moment she opened her eyes. Evangeline was startled to see the girl jump onto the furniture and warned her that the object belonged to the noblewoman. But before she could pull her away, the MC found the compartment she'd been searching for, dropping to the floor a very important object which caused alarm in the women immediately. It was a recording stone. That leaves the girl confused, mentally questioning the absence of the dice described in her memory. Quickly, Evangeline reported to the Duchess about the appearance of the recording stone inside the vanity. Right away, Inanna associated the secret compartment and the object with the genius of her late daughter. Trembling with emotion, the Duchess activated the magical object, making Ariadne's familiar voice echo through the room, saying hi to her mother exactly as in the skunk's vision. Immediately, Inanna felt a tightness in her chest, as if she were short of breath. She falls to the floor, caught by the nanny in time. Florine watched the scene with the same dread as the maid. In the recording, Ariadne's image smiled and expressed her love for her parents, admitting this was the first time she was using those affectionate terms openly. And she explained she wanted to record her affection on video, since she'd never told them she loved them with those words. She commented she recognized the size of the love and sacrifice they'd made to raise her in Caraxes. The heir shifted focus a bit, saying she knew her parents worried about the fact she'd gone to war, but she argued her going to the battlefield was her ultimate duty as a member of Derbliane, and asked that, in case of tragedy, they regard the sacrifice as an honor to the clan, promising to do everything possible to return, and demanding her parents live a long time to see their future grandchildren grow up. But before turning it off, the girl says goodbye, saying once again that she loved her father and mother. The recording deeply moved not only the Duchess, but also the patriarch, who'd arrived in the room in the meantime. He lamented in tears the departure of the rebellious daughter who'd left her elderly parents behind. Inanna collapsed into sobs and a tight hug, murmuring that she felt a painful longing for her daughter, and the head of the family hugged her, comforting her. And he asked her to cry and release all the emotions she'd repressed for so long so she could go back to living well, because he knew that was exactly how their daughter would want to see her mother. Evangeline held Florine amid the tears, and the girl rooted internally for the recording to bring peace to the Duchess's heart. The patriarch turned to the MC and asked whether she'd been the one responsible for finding the relic. Awkwardly, the girl confirmed his suspicions, and the leader questioned how she discovered the secret compartment that not even the parents knew existed, which caught her off guard. But she decided to use the same excuse as before, explaining she'd just followed the mysterious shine she'd seen come from the furniture. The head of the family was surprised by the justification and deduced the girl had witnessed a flow of magic energy, praising her capability. In the end, that didn't matter much, because he was more than happy with that gift. As a sign of deep gratitude, the patriarch promised to grant any wish the girl made as a reward for the gift, leaving our girl excited. She watches Anana, who was no longer crying, thoughtful. So she asked for some time to think it over before making a decision, receiving the leader's smiling, satisfied yes. The MC smiles too, guaranteeing she'd reveal her wish as soon as she'd decided. But later, alone in her bed, the girl lamented in her thoughts for not having asked for the right to choose immediately. But she figured the moment of mourning and memory of Ariadne was too sacred for the couple, and that bringing up political matters about the heir's succession at that instant would be inappropriate. She knew they probably needed more time processing Lady Ariadne's memories. And the girl gets sad, thinking she'd give anything to have a family that would mourn her death. Florine bursts into tears thinking about that scenario, but she scolds herself quickly, since she shouldn't cry about that when she was already being treated with so much kindness by the family. Besides, she felt that if she got sensitive over every little thing, she wouldn't survive that place, so she needed to stay strong. In the following class, Lafrine resumed the teachings, addressing natural transformation methods for albinos, revealing there were procedures that put one's life at risk. He detailed that the Council of Elders had sent a formal proposal demanding the young lady be placed in the cheetah's cage as a survival test, which left the MC indignant, wondering about her chances of survival in a place like that. However, the tutor calmed the girl down by reporting the patriarch's immediate reaction, who'd rejected the proposal and asked the elders whether they'd forgotten whose daughter the girl was, guaranteeing with total confidence that he'd protect her from any threat. This reassures our girl, and Lafrine added that, following the Duchess Anana's recommendations, the class schedule would be changed to focus on developing the girl's magical perception. Florine filled with hope and gratitude upon realizing the Duchess had kept the promise made at the previous meeting. Recalling the moment the noblewoman had guaranteed sending a specialized tutor for her to learn more about Oculus, so the assistant explained they'd be learning about the manifestation of Oculus, asking the girl to take a look at some cards. The tutor presented 3 options with the symbols of the sword, the magic wand, and a fairy, asking the young woman to choose the development path she found most appealing. Florine analyzed the drawings and said she wasn't very interested in those, since she preferred black magic, which surprises Lafrine greatly, but the girl insists enthusiastically, and explained she knew she didn't have much skill with it, but she wasn't worried because she could count on Caraxes, who was the best mage in the tower. In the middle of the enthusiastic explanation, a noise drew the MC's attention, and the assistants, who glared at the door angrily. The girl gets confused because she thought only she and the tutor were in the room, but she soon realized the sound came from the golem pom-pom, who was nestled in her tail and emitting a warning sound signal. Lafrine adjusted his glasses and analyzed the creature with suspicion, announcing right after that the class would have to be interrupted and postponed to the next morning due to an unforeseen event in the schedule, which Florine laments, but she already says goodbye. So the assistant promised to notify her as soon as the new timetable was set, asking right after whether he could borrow the golem pom-pom for a moment. Surprised by the request, the girl handed over the doll obediently, only asking that he remember to return it later. The tutor smiled openly and guaranteed he'd deliver the creature personally to her room, asking her not to worry. Despite the sudden interruption, the girl concluded the break in the schedule would be useful for reflecting on the wish she'd asked the patriarch. At last, she says goodbye to Lafrine with a huge smile on her face. As soon as he was alone in the room, the boy asked seriously whether he'd given him permission to monitor the clan's classes. To the man's surprise, the golem pom-pom emitted an apology, and a blinding teleportation light filled the room, revealing the figure of the young master in person. The guy justified his intrusion, claiming curiosity to monitor the future daughter-in-law's well-being and check whether anyone was bothering her, making it clear he'd only taken a superficial look at the official teaching schedule. Lafrine was still angry at the audacity and stated he wasn't bothering the girl, so he'd better stop that or he'd abandon the post and report the situation to the patriarch, which makes Caraxes apologize amid laughter. The assistant stared at the young master in total hopelessness and changed the subject, asking whether he was really in the Yantarosa mountain range, something the guy confirmed but lamented he couldn't find any trace of Sir Idaho in the region. The mention of the old knight's name made Lafrine remember the man had abandoned the post of commander of the knights out of the remorse of not having been able to protect Lady Ariadne, opting to isolate himself in the heart of the dense forest. Caraxes knew all that, but even so, he smiled self-confidently, guaranteeing he'd bring the solution to his future daughter-in-law as quickly as possible, regardless of the obstacles in the way. Faced with that expression, Lafrine was completely speechless. The moment Caraxes finished the sentence, the assistant warned him frantically, reminding him that, despite everything, he didn't have permission to blow up the whole mountain or set the forest on fire, ordering him not to do anything crazy. And the mage reflected and commented he'd need to go to that extreme for Sir Idaho to finally appear and face him. Hearing that, Lafrenion shouted immediately, threatening that if he did that he'd tell the young lady everything. Caraxes let out a sigh, yielding to the argument and pondering that, in that case, all that was left was the option of drawing a big magic circle to summon all the polar leopards in the area. But Lafrenion didn't seem interested and just asked him to resolve it peacefully. At last, the young master smiled confidently and guaranteed he knew what to do, promising to get in touch as soon as everything was resolved. To which the assistant answered that he hoped for a positive response and that he'd await good news. So they hung up the call. In that same instant, Caraxes' voice echoed through the forest, noting the hidden man had surely heard the whole conversation and ordering him to come out of hiding. But he didn't have much success with the request. Honestly, he'd already expected the guy wouldn't reveal himself so easily, but he hadn't made that whole journey for nothing. He'd gone there just to find him, and Florine needed the support of the Idaho family, since no one would dare belittle the girl, if behind her there was a loyal ally of noble lineage. So the mage thought to himself that maybe Sir Idaho would change his mind after meeting the little one. Because, at least to him, the MC looked a lot like his late sister, admitting to himself that his desire to keep her in the clan also came from that resemblance, and reaffirming the need to bring the knight back. With that thought, he called out for Salons. Caraxes analyzed the surroundings and noticed the man was nearby. He announces loudly that there was a child who needed the protection of a marquis, lying that it was a girl Lady Ariadne had left in his care before departing. And that catches the man's attention. Salons' deep voice echoed, asking whether that was really true, and Caraxes confirmed promptly, even though he knew it was a huge lie. But he considered it harmless. He knew the knight had sworn loyalty only to Ariadne and that he was currently wandering around lost, having lost his purpose in life. For that reason, Caraxes insisted on calling the guy back so he'd return and see in person what the late heir had left behind. Salons didn't answer immediately, immersed in his own thoughts. Amid the vastness of snow, the two remained silent face to face, and Caraxes' heart filled with the expectation that a child like Florine would be worthy of becoming the knight's new purpose in life. Back at the mansion, a brown-haired maid commented with wide eyes whether her colleague had heard the news, and the blonde girl smiled in confirmation, detailing that the young lady had found the relic Lady Ariadne had kept hidden. Both continued the conversation enthusiastically, exalting the number of achievements the little one had reached in such a short time since her arrival, and the blonde admitted she'd hesitated at first, but that now she was certain the girl really could be the saint, adding that the mansion's atmosphere had become more cheerful after her arrival, and electing the little one as everyone's savior. In the end, she suggested they prepare a big banquet to celebrate the young lady. Oblivious to the preparations, Florine listened to the compliments directed at her. In the room, Linda smiled as she held a mirror, announcing the makeup was done, and asking whether the mistress would like to evaluate the result. Florine accepted happily, and the maid handed her the object enthusiastically, stating she looked extremely cute. Florine herself was surprised by her own beauty upon looking at the reflection, praising Linda's effort in the styling and thanking her for the work she'd done. The maid answered happily that that day was all about the little mistress, but that statement made Florine's discouragement return, realizing that was the reason she'd been getting made up since the first hours of the morning. Linda laughed discreetly and commented there were many dresses she wanted to try on the girl. Next, Linda suggested that, since there was still some time before the banquet started, the little one take a stroll with the knight John to clear her head. Florine accepted, exhausted, agreeing she needed some fresh air. So the maid left in a hurry, saying she'd sort out the details of the stroll immediately, and asking her to wait. Florine stayed still, very tired from all the preparations. Honestly, that banquet in her honor was leaving her super anxious, since it was something she'd never dared imagine in her past lives. So she let herself be happy for a moment. At the same time, in another room, Gerard slammed the table furiously. He questioned what the MC had that was so special for everyone to make such a fuss and organize a banquet because of her, finding it all very ridiculous. He remembered well Florine's expressive face and her words about him being just one candidate among many, which only increased his rage. The boy shouted that he was clearly superior to the other competitors in swordsmanship and in all other disciplines, reminding himself he'd given up his spot at the Knights Academy just to join that clan. But now his reputation had been stained because of some random albino of unknown origin, which had made the other candidates start to belittle him. Overcome with hatred, Gerard turned to his ally and asked whether he considered that kind of treatment fair. The lackey answered firmly, asking who dared treat a prince that way. He states that could never be forgiven and asked whether he should kick off the prince's plan. With a determined look, Gerard ordered the plan be executed immediately, and he wanted to know whether the preparations had been completed without leaving traces, something the servant confirmed without thinking twice. Besides, he revealed that as soon as the queen read his letter, she'd sent him there without anyone knowing, which reassures the child even further. The ally detailed the strategy, explaining that if the heir's residence were destroyed, the prince would be seen as one of the victims, drastically reducing the suspicions about him. However, the lackey warned that, before the bomb exploded, Gerard should move to an area with more people to gather witnesses who could clear him. The prince confirmed he was aware of the instructions and ordered him to make sure to detonate it at the right moment. At last, the child says he'd head to the banquet and leaves the rest under the allies' responsibility, who bows before Gerard in respect. Before leaving, the little one reaffirmed they were doing all this for the good of Lacanbium, and the boy repeats the motto, "Everything for Lacanbium," with a proud smile on his face. Outside, Florine's appearance set off immediate whispers among the guests, who pointed excitedly at the young lady of the rumors going around the kingdom. While the MC was settled on the knight John's shoulder, two guards approached John and mocked his big promotion, showing envy of the position. The blonde girl addressed Florine cheerfully, suggesting that if the knight ever made a slip, the mistress dump him and call her for the spot. And the blue-haired young man joined the mood, asking that he be chosen in his place. Faced with so much enthusiasm, Florine answered timidly that John had been doing an excellent job, and the two faked disappointment with the answer. Soon John cut off the uncomfortable subject, warning his colleagues that the young lady was getting uncomfortable and withdrawing from the spot. The blonde huffed, annoyed at the guard's killjoy attitude. Away from the crowd, Florine sighed in relief, but she could still hear the staff's laments in the distance, who expressed envy of John and voiced the desire to see the little one up close and pet her soft tail. The girl turned to her protector and asked timidly whether she was really that cute. She knew it was a kind of strange thing to ask, but she was also aware anyone would find a small, fragile animal adorable. However, she pondered that everyone there was a beast person, and that she was just an albino with no magical capabilities, so it was hard to believe she was genuinely liked by everyone. John was startled by the little one's doubt and comforted her promptly, guaranteeing she was extremely cute and questioning her uncertainty. Faced with the girl's surprise, John lifted her in his arms and declared firmly that it was natural for the clan's adults to find the cubs adorable, stating the only ones in the wrong there were those who used prejudice against albinos to intimidate her. The words made Florine reflect that, drawing a parallel to the human world, she too found babies cute, so it wasn't all that strange to think that way about herself. Besides, the guy comments she seemed very worried about her inability to transform, deciding to reveal a fact to reassure her. The girl got very interested until the knight explained the majority of cubs had no control over the transformation and spent their childhood in their animal forms, clarifying that the only prodigies capable of changing form early on were exceptional members of the Dribliane clan. This revelation excited Florine, who wanted to know whether the rule applied to the cubs of the other lineages. John confirmed it did, explaining families capable of producing alpha-level prodigies were extremely rare. The clarification leaves our girl calmer, and she understands no child was born perfect and justified her earlier nervousness by the fact she'd taken Dribliane's genius as a universal benchmark. At last, relieved, she thanked John and guaranteed she was fine, settling comfortably onto her protector's shoulder again, and promising herself to live without more pressure, certain her human form would emerge at the right moment. Suddenly, a suspicious noise from the forest broke the calm and put them on maximum alert. It was coming from amid the crooked trees, which was a little scary. John felt a pang of bad feeling, judging he knew what it might be. Nervous, Florine suggested something serious was happening and ordered them to go check the place. The knight nodded and dashed toward the dense woods. With each step they took, the sound got louder. Following the rumble, the duo came upon three boys running desperately amid tears, screaming about the presence of a monster in the forest. In the disorderly flight, a brown-haired boy collided violently with John and raised his terrified gaze. But upon recognizing the knight, the boy showed surprise. John soon furrowed his brow with displeasure and asked whether the young masters had gotten into another fight. The mention of it being something that had happened before surprised Florine, but she stayed quiet, and the guard continued with a severe expression, reminding the boys about the young lady's welcome banquet that would happen that night and ordering them to return to their quarters to get ready. Something the boys shot back angrily, claiming they were already on their way and demanding the knight leave them alone. Fleeing right after, accompanied by the blue-haired colleague, Florine analyzed the cold, severe posture John had taken on, realizing the conflict situation between the boys was recurring. Curious, she spotted a red-haired boy fallen under a tree and deduced the others had gathered just to beat him up, wondering whether this always happened. Determined to intervene, she leapt off John's shoulder, startling her protector, and approached the wounded boy with caution. She asked whether everything was all right, pointing out the seriousness of the injuries and inviting him to go with her to get medical care, before the wounds left permanent scars. However, Florine interrupted her own speech suddenly. There was something special about that child. He had an incredible beauty, very different from anything she'd ever seen. The exotic features of his face, despite the scratches, made him even more hypnotizing, and Florine keeps fixing her eyes on the boy without even blinking. Noticing the little one's fixed gaze, the redhead turned his face away timidly. John approached and asked whether the others had assaulted the little boy again, calling him young Master Ian, and his name catches our girl's attention. because she remembered the family tree lessons, identifying the boy as Ian Dribblain, the firstborn of Ariadne. John suggested taking the boy to the infirmary immediately, and Florine agrees, recognizing the need for medical care due to the seriousness of the injuries. However, Ian refused stubbornly, demanding the matter stay secret. As she insisted on the request, Florine noticed another detail. The boy's hands and tiger tail were exposed, which makes her conclude the seriousness of the injuries was preventing him from fully sustaining his human form. She knew that, if she left him in that state, things could get even worse. That's why the little one bellowed they were going to the infirmary immediately, arguing that if they left him there, he'd only suffer more and the same boys from before might come back to bother him again. Besides, she said that if the boy really didn't want to go there, she could pretend to be sick so the doctor would go to her room personally. The truth is, ever since she'd seen his name on the family's family tree, the MC had tried to remember details about Ian Dribblain, but she only remembered that, in the second half of the story, all the clan's heirs had reached alpha status, except Ian was never considered an heir, which made her even more curious about his personality. And honestly, since he was Ariadne's biological son, the girl would never have imagined he was so mistreated by other boys. Ian kept his distance and ordered the girl to leave him in peace, but Florine could never do that. So she follows him, asking whether he'd go to the banquet that night. And she started commenting about the banquet and the roast turkey that would be served, promising to give him a gift if he accepted the treatment. The MC continued, threatening to punish the aggressors if she found them again. Noticing a change in the redhead's expression, she celebrated the success of all her chattering, and she tried to extend the conversation, commenting on the beauty of the weather that day. But Ian shot back coldly, pointing at the sky and mocking the girl's definition of beauty given the overcast weather. Even so, Florine insisted on the compliments, stating directly that the boy was very handsome, which made the redhead stammer with shyness. The moment was interrupted by a shout, asking whether the boy had acted violently once again. Florine got irritated by the intrusion of the man who'd shown up out of nowhere, and started giving Ian a real scolding. The newcomer bellowed that if the boy wanted to be the young lady's chosen one, he needed to maintain good manners and dignity, complaining he'd already told him dozens of times to stop those savage behaviors. Since she didn't know the guy, Florine was outraged at his audacity to yell at Ian like that, without even wanting to know what had happened first. To make matters worse, the man decreed that as punishment, Ian was forbidden from going to the banquet that night. And he made it clear he'd be disciplined. Honestly, that intrusion left Florine furious. After all, who was he to bar guests from a party held in her honor? That's when John whispered in her ear that this was Weasel, the heir's etiquette tutor. The revelation transformed Florine's fury into pure indignation. She found it a complete absurdity that such a rude man was, of all things, the manners teacher. And judging by his reaction, this wasn't the first time it had happened. But Florine wouldn't let someone like that man get away with so much rudeness. Determined not to let it slide, the girl confronted Weasel, demanding to know why he hadn't greeted her properly upon arriving. The tutor got a fright at the voice and stared at the little skunk with total disdain, wondering who that creature was. John cleared his throat loudly, on purpose, demanding the correct protocol with the young lady, but Weasel simply ignored Florine, completely changing his posture. He broke into a big smile to greet someone else. He walked straight up to John and asked, all enthusiastic, what brought the guard there? In a mocking tone, the teacher pointed at Florine and asked whether that little creature would be the clan's future mistress. A nickname that left the MC even more furious with the situation. Finally, the man bows and introduces himself formally as Weasel Mordenta, and said he was excited to work with the young one. Faced with all that abuse, the girl found herself with no choice and called out for pom-pom. She activated the golem, and the translator let out the girl's thoughts loud and clear, calling the tutor rude, which makes Weasel's eyes go wide. The little one continues, pointing out that for an etiquette teacher, he didn't know the basics about courtesy by ignoring the young lady. Besides, she defends Ian, explaining the boy had fallen into an ambush and questioning the reason for that unfair scolding. Weasel tried to give a flimsy excuse, explaining he'd erred because he got too excited reuniting with John and begged the girl's pardon. But right after, he changed his tone and stated the young lady didn't know Ian's true nature, which left her even more annoyed. At last, the servant reveals the boy carried the blood of an enemy nation, and was therefore totally barbaric. The teacher spewed his venom, saying everyone knew Lady Ariadne had gotten pregnant by a rival on the battlefield, and that the future mistress needed to open her eyes to that stain on the family. The revelation surprised Florine for a moment, but she soon felt disgust at that prejudice. Using pom-pom once more, she shot back. She asked who Ian's mother was, to which the steward answers it was Lady Ariadne. So the MC made it clear that by demeaning the late heir's eldest son, Weasel was insulting the very blood of the Dribblain clan. Cornered by the arguments, he lost all his bravado and started stammering, trying to defend himself by saying his concern was because no one knew whether the other half of the boy's blood came from mercenaries or common knights. Ignoring the man's excuses, she asks whether he meant the half of Ian that had Dribblain blood was worth nothing, leaving him more and more nervous. Florine turned to Ian suddenly and ordered him to explain the whole situation clearly. warning him that staying quiet and isolated wasn't going to solve anything. She felt a lot of pity for the boy's helplessness and low self-esteem, since she knew very well what that felt like. After all, she'd been in the same position. That's why the little one decided she'd be his protector from then on, since she'd been through similar suffering in the past. In the end, Florine called out to Weasel with contempt and guaranteed Ian that he was no longer alone in that mansion. Then she faced the teacher and declared Ian wasn't a nuisance at all, but a legitimate candidate to be her future husband. Florine ordered Weasel to get out of there and warned she'd report all that abuse straight to the patriarch. The tutor was shocked by the girl's firmness, but she didn't even let him speak, interrupting the man by decreeing he should shut his mouth and listen. Giving her word as heir of the family, she guarantees Ian wasn't just an ordinary child. In reality, he was a prodigy destined to awaken as an authentic alpha. That prophecy caught Ian himself by surprise and left Weasel paralyzed for a moment. But right after, the teacher burst out laughing and mocked the claim, saying the girl lived up to the rumors of being someone quite different from the others. He argued that if Ian really had alpha potential, he'd have already shown the courage to fight back against the assaults. Pointing at the boy's deplorable state and asking whether a creature like that would have any chance of evolving, Florine shot back instantly, arguing the boy got no support from anyone and that it'd be impossible to win alone, but guaranteeing time would prove Ian's triumph. Irritated by the little skunk's insistence, Weasel just thought the girl was pathetic for believing she could get far protecting that brat. But he knew he shouldn't interfere too much, since after all, in Dribbliane, they only raised the cubs that survived a fall off the abyss. Honestly, his urge was to silence the girl by force, but he knew it was better to control himself, since he couldn't win against John if the two got into a clash over Florine. Besides, he believed the albino's generosity would run out the moment she realized the boy was a weakling incapable of defending his own life and unworthy of being part of the main house. That's why he gave a fake smile, said he'd be delighted if the prediction came true, and left right after. Overcome with fury, Florine promised herself that man would bitterly regret so much arrogance. Ian finally spoke up, saying she didn't need to have stepped in to defend him. The reaction surprised the little one, and he continued, stating he didn't need Florine's help for anything. His comments make the MC find the boy pretty rude, but she figured early puberty justified his difficulty in thanking her for the help, so it was better to let it go. Determined to keep supporting the boy, she reaffirmed she trusted his potential as an alpha, and she sought John's backing, who thinks before confirming the girl's analysis, pointing out the young master's physical movement indicated a hidden talent, making it clear he wasn't saying that just to be nice, and this confirmation brought a temporary sparkle to Ian's eyes, which soon faded as he complained that, if he had so much talent, he didn't understand why he'd been forbidden from entering the military academy. The complaint revealed the boy's true desire, and Florine felt a lot of pity for the suffering he kept in silence. Ian tried to take his words back, thinking he'd exposed himself too much, but Florine interrupted him affectionately, saying his presence there guaranteed her a new friend in the mansion. The term friend surprised the redhead, and Florine broke into a big smile, sealing the pact of friendship between the two, and calling him in for a hug. Ian refused the gesture, all awkward, questioning the need for all that display of affection, but the girl insisted in a relaxed way for him to overcome the shyness, leaving John just watching the interaction and celebrating the success and getting the boy to relax a bit. The MC knew he'd get used to her touches after a while. Suddenly, a familiar smell hit Florine's nose, a fragrance of cinnamon in the air. Right away, she remembered the classes about the real estate market Lafrienne had given recently, specifically about the components of the clan's ammunition. The girl was alarmed upon realizing the smell was gunpowder, and she found it strange the chemical compound was there, since the classes had been suspended because of the banquet. Noticing her sudden change in posture, Ian wanted to know why she was analyzing the surroundings in silence. Florine played it off to disguise it, but she realized that combination of gunpowder and a beaten-up Ian seemed all too familiar, forcing her memory against the intensity of the smell that was disrupting her thoughts. Florine searched for the details from the book, until, finally, something came to mind. She remembered that 10 years before the main plot, a great explosive attack had destroyed the heir's residence and resulted in Ian's death. Only then did our girl remember exactly the boy's mention in the story. Recalling the original story, Florine pictured perfectly the scene where Rihan and Gerard had a romantic encounter at the heir's residence. Back then, the saint was super excited to see the training site of Dribbliane's successors, and she commented she'd heard rumors about a terrible accident that had destroyed the old structure, lamenting that the victim was someone so young. Seizing the chance to play the gentleman, Gerard lied without batting an eye, and commented the victim was Ian, faking deep sadness over the tragic fate of the good boy, all to move his partner and win her heart. Of course, Raheen was charmed by the prince's supposed sensitivity, who kept courting her with sweet words, lying as he said he liked everything about the girl, who got more and more charmed by those lies. After all, she didn't even know who Ian was and only faked all that so Raheen would look on him favorably. As long as she fell for his nonsense, Gerard was willing to lie about whatever it took. Except, deep down, he was hiding the fact he'd been the real perpetrator of the explosion that destroyed the place in childhood. And he even coldly lamented not having eliminated all the competitors at once. so he wouldn't have to share the saint's attention with anyone else. The memory shocked Florine, who finally understood the gravity of the story and the reason Ian had died in the original timeline due to Gerard's schemes. At first, she thought about telling everything straight to the patriarch, but she judged that disarming the bomb without catching the mastermind in the act would let the culprits get off unpunished to plan new attacks. Convinced the saboteur wanted to cause chaos in the clan, she thinks for a moment about how to act, until a great idea comes to mind. Sometime later, in the corridors of the heir's residence, Gerard bellowed enraged. Upon learning the banquet's location had been changed suddenly, the prince was outraged at the abrupt move of the event to the successor's own pavilion, and his lackey begged him to stop so no one would hear the protests. Overcome with hatred, the boy complained his plan ran the risk of falling apart, revealing he'd intended to blow up the structure to cause an uproar while the court was distracted in the main building, with the goal of blaming the albino for the disaster and forcing her expulsion from the family once and for all. Except the change of plans turned the place into the stage of an improvised treasure hunt, attracting dozens of staff who hid prizes in the corners and praised the young lady's initiative for such a fun afternoon. The coming and going of staff struck panic in Gerard, who feared they'd discover the explosives hidden around there. So, the little one ordered the lackey to collect all the bombs immediately. The accomplice agreed, worried, and decided to start the removal from the nearest points. The saboteur's plan was interrupted when someone showed up out of nowhere, saying they hadn't hidden anything yet for the guys to be in such a hurry. It was our girl on John's head, questioning why the two were searching for something. The interruption startled the servant, who recoiled in fear of being caught red-handed. He was more than nervous. He didn't need more distractions at such a tense moment and could only think about what a disaster it would be if someone noticed the gunpowder on the floor. The guy tried to think of an escape route, knowing the keen sense of smell of the girl's animal form and the presence of the big bruiser guard put their lives at risk if they made any wrong move. Forcing an excuse, the servant lied, saying he was actually on his way to hide his treasure. With a mocking smile, Florine demanded to see the object he was hiding behind his back. The lackey tried to dodge the interrogation, explaining the object was too simple to call a treasure after all, and that the surprise needed to be kept until the official start of the game, but the girl stamped her foot and ordered the item be handed over immediately. The man froze, mentally cursing the little skunk's insistence, while Gerard ground his teeth in rage, calling Florine a crazy skunk. Realizing this wasn't going to end well, the guy argued with John that it wasn't yet the permitted moment for the activity, but the knight remained totally faithful to Florine's orders and reinforced that the young lady wanted to see the object at that exact moment. Pressured, the servant feigned obedience, praying the girl wouldn't drop the black ball on the floor, or everything would go up in flames. So he handed over the device with a trembling hand, asking the girl to hold the supposed prize with the utmost care in the world. Florine held the object and made a face of total disgust, saying it was ugly, heavy, and too dull to be a valuable item. Sweating with dread, the lackey agreed and tried to take the device back with a forced laugh, saying he needed to go hide it in the corners of the house. But the girl refused the request, shocking the boy. Faced with the man's desperate question about why she was keeping the object, Florine decided to give the duo a little scare, threatening to throw the bomb on the floor while telling them to catch it, making the two saboteurs scream in terror and cower in the corner, before pulling her hand back with a smile, revealing it was just a joke. The scare left the lackey in doubt about whether the girl was acting out of pure childish foolishness or whether she already knew the truth about the bomb. And Florine had fun with the duo's panic. Determined to squeeze their minds even further, she faked a new explosion threat, making the lackey take off running down the corridors, desperate to save himself before the device's timer hit 0. But upon noticing there'd been no blast at all and that the corridor remained in absolute silence, the man looked back confused and saw the threat was just another of the girl's provocations, realizing the main explosive was already safely secured in the knight John's hands. Confident, Florine commented that apparently there really was something inside the object. Only then did the assistant realize the girl had set the whole thing up. He thought that now that he'd already been exposed, it'd be better to hurry and grab the other bombs scattered around the palace, because if he delayed even a minute, the whole building would be ruined, which would make everything even worse since not only would he be punished for his actions, but the nation of Lekenbium would be totally destroyed. However, the lackey's escape was cut off by a firm voice, which announced it hadn't been entirely sure before. But apparently Florine was completely right. The man's eyes went wide in pure horror at the sight of that scene. The Duchess Inanna had appeared in the corridor, accompanied by 2 Black Panthers on guard. With a severe and implacable look, the noblewoman confronted the saboteur, warning she'd personally step in to grab the explosives if he insisted on causing disorder, and she accused him of trying to stain the clan's honor with that unforgivable affront. Under the Duchess's orders, the Panthers advanced baring their teeth, and captured the lackey, who collapsed to the floor in a state of shock. With the threat neutralized, the mansion's routine went back to normal. Florine enjoyed the affection and coziness of Inanna's arms, marveling at the noblewoman's warmth and protection. The Duchess stroked the little one's white fur and praised her extraordinary wisdom, highlighting that the girl had cracked the explosives plot just by noticing the traces of gunpowder on the suspect's feet. Florine smiled happily and pretended it was no big deal, hiding the fact that she knew everything from having already read the book. And Inanna praised the cleverness of the improvised treasure hunt, figuring the girl had changed the event's location on purpose to force the culprit to expose himself trying to collect the bombs. Sincerely, the MC commented on her fear that the guests would get hurt if the plan went wrong, winning the Duchess's heart even more, who celebrated Florine's entrance into her family, adding that she'd order a heavy investigation in Dribliane to punish whoever ordered the attack, making it clear the girl wouldn't need to worry about anything, which made her even happier. Of course, she hid that she well knew about the Kingdom of Lykenbium's secret involvement, but she preferred to keep it secret for now, to let the clan do a clean sweep of its political enemies all at once. Taking advantage of the closeness and feigning a child's innocence, Florine cried fake tears, drawing Inanna's attention, and asked whether the clan's rules allowed tutors to hit the heirs, which leaves the Duchess taken aback, until she revealed that Teacher Weasel had assaulted Ian, saying it was a punishment. The revelation left the Duchess with a frozen expression. She was indignant about the abuse that had happened while she was isolated and thanked the girl for the report, promising to intervene personally to punish whoever let it happen. Satisfied with the success of her scheme, Florine thought Ian should be there to hear the good news, realizing it'd been a few hours since she'd last seen him. Noticing the confusion on the MC's face, the Duchess asked what she was looking for. To which she answers, she wanted to tell Ian what had happened, but didn't see him around, and the woman explains he was probably in his room, since the boy was super shy and lonely. Determined, Florine smiles, saying she'd find him personally, making the lady reveal his room was the last door to the east on the second floor. Our girl headed there thoughtful, judging that the Duchess's isolation had worsened Ian's loneliness and distrust toward his own family. But she didn't blame him for not trusting Inanna much, since after all she'd closed herself off so much and left the boy to deal with all the problems there alone. But she promised herself she'd be his support from then on to guarantee the redhead would be happy, even if it was hard for him to adapt to that new reality at first. As she advanced down the deserted corridor calling out his name, she joked in a relaxed way about the boy's shyness under John's smiling gaze, cheerfully calling her friend to come out of the room and enjoy the banquet. All that calm was broken out of nowhere by a devastating explosion that struck the pavilion. John fell into despair upon seeing the wave of fire surge toward the young lady and screamed her name in sheer panic. The girl was still processing what she was seeing right in front of her, while splinters of wood and debris flew toward the girl, who let out a cry of pain before passing out. A bit dizzy, Florine wondered whether she'd died even before feeling the physical pain, but she soon realized she was protected in the knight John's arms, who'd used his own body as a shield to save her from the collapse. The guard wanted to know whether the little one was all right, with all the gentleness in the world, and Florine thanked him with tears in her eyes, asking whether he'd gotten hurt. But John downplayed his own injuries with a comforting smile and warned they needed to find young Master Ian urgently before the ceiling caved in completely. The girl agreed at once, saying that saving her friend was the top priority. The knight asked her to hold on tight and ran through the burning debris, facing new ceiling collapses that closed off the exits, and making Florine scream for Ian, praying he was nearby. The two ran without stopping amid the disasters all around, always bellowing for Ian and dodging the crossfire of flames they were caught in. At one point, John asked whether Florine was okay, and she answered yes, despite being very distressed by the speed at which the ceiling was collapsing. She despaired at the possibility that Ian might not be there anymore, even though she knew they could no longer turn back since it would be a risk to her life and John's. So she asked the knight to hurry, rooting in her thoughts for her friend to be alive and somewhere nearby. The duo finally found the red-haired prince inside a room, but the boy remained still with a cold face. Florine doesn't waste time and tells the little guy to come out with them, leading the way, but he stays silent, staring at them, until he said the two could leave without him, which makes Florine bellow in confusion. He continued, saying he'd stay right there since he'd always expected a tragic ending for his lonely life. The boy's coldness broke Florine's heart, who remembered the abuse and loneliness he'd suffered in the original story, and she understood why Ian felt that way. But she wasn't going to leave him there to die. That's why, determined to pull him out of that melancholy, she screamed she'd never leave him behind and threatened to stay there to die alongside him if he insisted on giving up. Ian turned on her furiously, calling her crazy and telling her to get the hell out of there. Except Florine noticed the real concern behind the boy's rudeness, since she did the same thing, always putting up walls so no one would get close to her and get hurt. Finally, our girl jumped into the middle of the fire to reach him, telling him to survive to show his worth and take revenge on those who'd humiliated him in the past. He had to show his abusers he could have a truly good life, since after all, Ian hadn't done anything wrong. The little one's eyes started to water with emotion upon hearing Florine's shouts telling him to live. Now that she'd seen all of Ian's secrets, the MC couldn't simply leave him there to die. She cared too much about him. So, with tears in her eyes to disarm the boy for good, she said he was her future husband and that he needed to live to fulfill that role. Seeing the prince confused, she grabbed his arm firmly and thought that if she died there, she ran the risk of reincarnating as a dung beetle in her next life. Ian complained about the girl's total lack of sense, but the conversation was cut off by a huge piece of ceiling that collapsed right on top of the children's heads. John ran with all his strength in a desperate attempt to protect them, and Florine closed her eyes, hearing a deafening ringing, fearing the worst ending for her journey and lamenting losing the home she'd just conquered. Flashes of her life passed through her mind, seeing the family she'd built smile in front of her. She even wondered whether, if she did reincarnate as a beetle, it'd be possible to roll all the way to Debris Lane to see if she could get one more chance to become the family's daughter-in-law. But the darkness vanished with Caraxus's familiar snap of the fingers, who commented in a relaxed way that he needed to get proper clothes for the girl. The voice made Florine suddenly wake from her nightmare, recognizing that voice very well, and coming face to face with the young master at her side, who celebrated the fact the little one woke up and comforted her by praising her courage and persistence during the chaos. Not believing what she was seeing, she wanted to be sure she was in front of her real protector. That's when the guy gave her head a pat, confirming by the touch that she'd already woken from the dream for real, but the little one still didn't understand what had happened. Now she had a human form, and she really had survived all that chaos. She wonders whether Caraxus had shown up and saved her before she was crushed by the debris. Afraid, the little one ran to give him a hug, crying with emotion, asking why he'd taken so long to come back. And Caraxus gave a light smile and joked he'd teleported as fast as he could, taking the chance to praise the girl for having turned a scenario of total destruction into a real show of beauty, which left her a bit confused. Confused, Florine looked around and realized she was lying right in the middle of a giant pile of fragrant flowers. The young master explained all those flowers were the girl's own doing, leaving her open-mouthed at the revelation. Caraxus showed her the mirror, and she still didn't understand what he meant, until the guy suggested she take a look at her own reflection. Afraid she really had reincarnated as some weird creature, Florine looked and froze in total shock upon seeing the reality was very different. Now she had a human form as adorable as her animal form. The girl questions the mirror, wanting to know where the skunk had gone and who that was in the reflection. Caraxus laughed at the girl's fright and asked why so much surprise, getting a stammering, confused confirmation from the new human, who was amazed at being able to move her own hands freely. The celebration was cut off by the arrival of the Duchess Inanna, who shouted Florine's name in sheer astonishment. The noblewoman couldn't believe the little one's transformation, and Florine confirmed with a big smile that she'd become human. Besides having turned the fire of the collapse into that beautiful carpet of flowers, the Duchess explained, full of admiration, that an elemental shift like that was a rare thing, exclusive to extremely powerful mages, and deduced that the girl's biological parents were surely great sorcerers. The revelation left Florine thoughtful, wondering where all that hidden power came from, while Inanna praised how clear her speech had suddenly become. At this, the Knight John came closer to congratulate the young lady on the transformation. Florine got super happy to see her protector again and asked, worried whether he'd gotten hurt in the collapse. The guard knelt full of respect and guaranteed with a laugh that he was perfectly fine thanks to her help, telling her not to worry her head about it. Relieved, our girl ran to hug him and declared that, from then on, the knight would be her best friend and most trustworthy protector in the clan, since he'd risked his life for her. John thanked her for the honor with a happy smile, saying he was just doing his duty as a knight. But the guard's courage moved Florine, who admired that man more and more for his responsibility and care for her. She thanks him once more, giving the guard an affectionate kiss on the cheek as a thank you, leaving the Knight John completely red and flustered by the affection from his little mistress. Right then, Caraxus complained in a jealous tone, reminding her that he was the one who'd saved her life and arguing that this division of rewards wasn't fair at all. He charged that, as future mistress, she should distribute the prizes equally, leaving Florine at a loss for what to say. In her thoughts, the girl considered whether he was wanting a kiss too, finding it absurd given it was Caraxus Dryblaine, a man famous all over the world. But acknowledging he really had saved her skin, she looked up kind of reluctantly and asked him to put her on the floor, saying she couldn't do anything in his arms. Caraxus shot back with some boldness, asking whether just putting her on the floor would solve the problem. And he went ahead and warned her that his demand was a kiss on the left cheek and another on the right. He justified that, as the master of the mansion, he deserved a bigger prize than the family knights. Florine didn't much like the logic, but she admitted to herself he had a point, accepting the conditions resignedly. She came close and gave an affectionate kiss on his cheek, defining the gesture as the payment for the rescue in the fire. And right after, she gave the second kiss, thinking in secret that this was the thank you for him having brought her into the clan. Noticing the girl's sudden pause, Caraxus wanted to know the reason for the interruption and asked what that second reward would be for. But Florine gave a mischievous laugh and answered it was a secret, quickly changing the subject by asking where Ian was. From everyone's reactions, she was sure the redhead hadn't suffered anything serious, but she needed to see him with her own eyes. The young master gave a discreet smile and pointed out that the one she was looking for was right there in front of her. The moment she saw Ian, our MC thrilled with joy and ran toward him, calling him by name and asking, super worried whether he'd gotten hurt, confessing the size of the anxiety she'd felt for him. The boy hesitated for a second and guaranteed he was fine, asking right after, a bit suspicious, whether she was really that skunk from before. Florine confirmed with a laugh, and Ian's face turned red on the spot, since the girl had a very pretty human form. Trying to hide his embarrassment, the redhead faked mockery and commented that by the loud tone of voice, it could only be that white, clingy skunk. That gratuitous rudeness left Florine a bit offended, not understanding the sudden mood change. But after analyzing his posture in silence for a moment, she figured out what was going on. And she covered her mouth, finding the boy's shyness funny and thinking about how cute he was. Wanting to give him a boost, she put her hand on Ian's shoulder and promised, full of confidence, that she'd take care of him from there on, jokingly suggesting he start calling her by her first name. But the redhead said they weren't that close. The complaint amused Florine even more, who felt more like teasing her future husband. That's why she gave him a surprise hug, asking him to relax and guaranteeing she'd wait however long it took for him to trust her. She promised to carry the weight of all his problems and put an end to all of them. But the MC stopped talking in the middle because she was struck by a doubt. She didn't know whether she'd dropped her guard out of nowhere. But a heavy sleep hit her full on. Ian was left not understanding a thing about the girl's speech and told her to let go of him, only to get an even bigger scare upon realizing she'd fallen asleep mid-sentence. Watching the scene, the Duchess Inanna commented in surprise on the size of the little one's exhaustion, and John offered right away to take her to her room immediately. As the knight carried out the order, Ian remained in a state of shock, wondering whether it was possible for someone to fall asleep that fast like that. Moments later, in Florine's room, Ian looked at the girl sleeping that peaceful sleep with a face of total helplessness, complaining to himself about how easily she conked out. Because earlier, when he finally saw the little one had fallen asleep, he got ready to stand up. He wondered what he was still doing there and tried to take off. But right when he thought he was going to manage to escape, Florine grabbed his hand in her sleep. With a kind of worried little face as she dreamed, the little one mumbled a request for him not to leave. And the sleeping girl's words left the redhead full of doubts, and he had to admit to himself that he couldn't ignore her requests. That's exactly why I love stories like this. There's just something so satisfying about a main character who looks like a tiny, helpless little fluffball, but is secretly the sharpest schemer in the entire room. What got me more than I expected was the family stuff. This is supposed to be the scariest, most ruthless clan in the world, and they all just completely fold for one kid. So cute. The slow burn future husband stuff is what really gets me though, especially with Ian. A lonely, mistreated kid who's convinced he's destined for a sad ending, and our girl just refuses to let him give up on himself? Yeah, that hit different. I'm so here for wherever that goes. Anyway, this one's called The Villain's Daughter-in-Law is Inherently Powerful, and I covered it all the way up to chapter 22. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Kisses, and see you next time.